Upcoming is the first video I ever recorded and edited. The audio quality was terrible, it was impossible to understand, and somehow the algorithm still blessed it. While you snooze, listen to a remastered version of the video with a quality microphone and audio balancing that isn't complete garbage. Deltarune YouTube still has a clickbait problem. If the original thumbnail for this video didn't make it clear enough, this video isn't really about predicting the story of Deltarune using a theory with a catchy name. I do think I have some interesting things to say about Deltarune, specifically revolving around a single line of text in Chapter 4 which has lived rent-free in my head for months now, and that I've thought about at least once a day since I read it, and still have since the making of this video, but I'll get to that. First I want to talk about my process, and why the current YouTube trend of theories and predictions surrounding this game kinda bugs me. When you look at your homepage on YouTube and you see all that sweet juicy content to fill that aching hole that's been left in all of our collective chests where Chapter 5 will one day sit, you're going to see 101 different Jockington Goner theory videos sitting there waiting to be consumed. Spoilers for chapters 1 through 4, by the way. When I see these videos, often they follow a similar pattern. They take their one-line snappy theory and present it as a thesis to be proved. Then, like filling a bucket, they piece through the game's text and imagery, searching for drops of evidence to pour into said Death Knight theory bucket. They might even, if they're thorough, place a second Kris Knight theory bucket down in front of you and fill that up too. Then, our helpful theorists measure each bucket and make a determination. This bucket is fuller than that bucket, this theory is more likely than that theory, this is my prediction for what is right, and I've solved Tricky Tony's puzzle. And everyone happily lancers away with their theory pail, or unhappily laments that they've missed this and that evidence droplet, and fills their papyrus Knight theory bucket way fuller than all the others, and so on and so forth. But that's not really how I like to think about media, especially not episodic media like Deltarune, where we have so much time to think about and digest each piece of it, while desperately craving the rest of it like a Hollow Knight fan craving the next game showcase, praying for the slightest bit of news about Silksong. This joke aged even more poorly the second time. It feels antagonistic to the author and to the readers, like Toby Fox is out to get me and I need to stay one step ahead. I need to know what's the most likely twist and turn to happen, and if I see them coming, then I won, and I was smarter than Fantastic Mr. Toby. Anyone who thought Azrael's dust theory was right was a big dumb idiot who lost. Instead, I like to look at a story like Deltarune's as a portrait that Toby Fox and his team are painstakingly sketching with one line of dialogue, one musical leitmotif, one extraordinary boss fight at a time. With every chapter, we get to see more of those strokes on the canvas, slowly revealing itself as, in this case, for no particular reason, let's say a tree. The main events of the story form the trunk, the branches and leaves, all the side plots, mysteries, and characters that flesh out the world and give our cast the motivations and drives to carry the plot forward. But we don't get to see the whole canvas, just bits and pieces that together form an illusion in the darker yet darker negative space between what we can see. Questions like, what caused Asgore to leave the police force? And what's the deal with the song from the sea? Act like the bases of these branches, stretching off into those blank spaces to one day be sketched to completion by an annoying dog. This negative space is where speculation and theorizing happens. It's where we can visualize all the different ways this tree could be drawn and connect and intertwine all of these lingering threads in a cohesive way. Not to try and deduce how the tree will actually look, but to follow the brushstrokes that Toby Fox is giving us and understanding the myriad ways the tree could look like in full, and what any of these could mean for the story he's trying to tell. Circling all the way back to the reason I'm making this video in the first place, it's one of these patches of negative space that I can't stop thinking about, that I can't with any confidence say what it means for the story of Deltarune, and it hinges entirely on one little piece of flavor text, a throwaway line amongst hundreds, unassuming and innocent, just another dialogue box to mash through as the player obsessively interacts with every object in every room. My mom just collects heart pillows for some reason. When Kris was little, they'd take one of these, then pretend to rip out their heart and chase me. What the heck does that mean? No, seriously, how am I supposed to interpret this flavor text? What do you mean when they were little they'd rip out their heart and chase Noelle? Am I supposed to read that literally, that they were playing pretend and chasing her? Am I supposed to think Noelle didn't know any better and that Kris was actually pulling their soul out? It's just a fourth wall breaking joke that I'm not even supposed to think about. If it is, then that's rough because I cannot stop thinking about this line. In every interpretation that isn't just, this is a funny haha joke to show Kris is a prankster and they never literally pretended to chase Noelle with a heart-shaped object, my mind keeps reeling at the implications. Keeping to the metaphor from before, I start drawing the rest of the branch that stretches out from this point, and in some cases it just turns into some eldritch horror abomination that swallows the rest of the tree whole, and as soon as I've turned away from it, I've forgotten it ever existed in the first place. 3. Broadly stated, I think there are 3 possible ways to interpret this line that make any amount of sense to my brain. In order from least shatters my brain to most. Number 1. It's just something Kris does. Kris, with their dog-like animal instinct, at a young age had a habitual impulse to tear their soul from their body, and seeing the horrific potential, decided to chase Noelle around with it or with a pillowy simulacrum. Everywhere else in Deltarune's world, humans grow up pulling their fonts of will and compassion from their chests, and it's just an ordinary fact of life. This answer is probably the closest to the cop-out answer of just don't think about it, lol, and it doesn't really satisfy that picture of a tree analogy I used earlier. It completes this little branch, sure, but it doesn't connect to any of our other lingering questions, it doesn't add substantially to the picture being drawn, and what it does add comes across as a little silly. This is the bucket theory that I think is the most likely, and if I were in the game to score prediction points, this is what I'd pick, and I'd go on with my life. But instead of settling for the likely but unsatisfying answer, let's paint a different picture. Number 2, someone taught Kris to do it. Kris, when they were little, was instructed on how to remove their soul from their body. Whether it's something all humans can accomplish, or if there's some prerequisite to the ability that was given at the time of, or potentially long after, the instruction, Kris was informed that such an action was possible by someone. You can start to paint a whole lot of different pictures with this start, and it certainly ties into a lot of the other lingering questions and ideas. To start with, we need to pick some potential candidates for this someone, and they need to meet some criteria. Number 1, knowledge of the human soul. You can't instruct Kris if you don't already know the mechanics of the human soul and how to extract it. Number 2, familiarity with the young Kris. You can't instruct Kris if you've never interacted with Kris, and Noelle specifies the age as when Kris was little, implying that at least a somewhat significant amount of time has passed since then. And that's all for the hard requirements, but there are some other softer considerations we can make. Number 3, motive for helping or hurting Kris. It's not entirely clear whether Kris's ability to remove their soul is entirely a positive or a negative one. We don't know what impact it has on Kris as a person, other than it seems to have opened opportunities for them, while also exposing them to harm. A strong motive for inflicting either of those effects, whether they skew positively or negatively, is a consideration. Number 4, motive for enabling Kris. By that I mean, whether or not a character has something to gain by teaching Kris this ability, and whether this nebulous someone needs or wants Kris to be able to remove their soul for some purpose. Let's start by looking at characters who have already been introduced to the story. Carol Holiday. Carol is perhaps the most glaringly obvious choice. In all likelihood, Carol is the voice, or one of the voices on the phone with Kris in Chapter 4. Her involvement in the story is clearly being set up as major, and it would make sense to intertwine her with Kris's early life. Let's look at our criteria. Number 1, knowledge of the human soul. From the knowledge we have, it's a safe bet that right now, at the moment taking place in the present of Deltarune, Carol is familiar with the human soul. The text this video revolves around takes place when examining the red heart-shaped pillows in the Holiday household, plus Noelle's line, "My mom just collects heart pillows for some reason," indicating they belong to Carol, is suspicious on its own, but combined with the phone call lines, "Need soul, without soul Kris will," and "Kris Dark World, no soul can't," that in all likelihood Carol spoke or was privy to being spoken, means she's aware of, and maybe even has a particular fascination with, Kris's human soul. Now, I was specific about presently, in this moment, Carol most likely knowing about the soul. It's harder to extrapolate that years and years into the past when the Dreamers and the Holidays were close. There's plenty of potential for Carol acquiring this knowledge, and perhaps obsession, long after Kris chased Noelle around with a heart-shaped object. For example, something terrible happens, perhaps to her daughter Des, which prompts Carol's involvement in the plot, via a very soul-related conspiracy with Kris and a random knight, which needs fountains to be created and subsequently closed by use of a human soul. But this picture works just as well with Carol possessing this knowledge from the beginning, and simply later putting it into practice with a decidedly unfun gang. I mark this criteria possible, but not guaranteed. Number 2, familiarity with the young Kris. An obvious yes, we've been treated to many examples of the two families' closeness at the time, moving on to the softer considerations. Number 3, motive for helping or hurting Kris. This one simply doesn't have enough evidence in the text to say one way or the other. We know Carol's portrayed with an icy disposition, but she's also shown a fondness for Kris, depending on your reading of this scene. But how much of that is manipulation, or how her feelings have shifted in the years since Carol would have helped or hurt Kris by teaching them how to tear their soul out is just impossible to know at this stage. Consider this criteria insubstantial. Number 4, motive for enabling Kris. Here's another clear yes. If you subscribe to the belief that Carol is the voice on the phone, in league with Kris and potentially other conspirators, Kris's human soul, based on the phone call, plays some pivotal role in Carol's plans, and Kris's ability to act independently of the soul is what allows them to attempt to accomplish Carol's instructions to keep Susie away from the guitar. And that's Carol Holiday. Here we see some of these plot threads start to tie together. Carol could have taught Kris at a young age in order to facilitate whatever conspiracy she and Kris are engaging in the present day, and doing so is what puts our heroes in motion from the very start. I think this is a fairly grounded explanation and ties in nicely with what we can already surmise about Carol and Kris's relationship and power dynamics. This is probably the last sane thing that'll be said in this video. Let's move on to the next candidate. The Vessel Creator. The mysterious disembodied bundle of all caps text who regularly possesses Toby Fox's social media accounts and whom the community is collectively convinced with good reason is our old friend Mr. W.D. Gaster. This is one of those theory buckets that's so full of evidence it's hard to ignore, but for the sake of completeness, I'm going to make the distinction between Gaster-based and non-Gaster-based evidence, including any assumptions being made about whether this potential Gaster is the same as or a similar archetype to Undertale's former royal scientist W.D. Gaster. On to the criteria. Number 1, knowledge of the human soul. Even without the Gaster connection, it's safe to assume the Vessel Creator has some specialized knowledge of the soul, specifically shown in the very first scene of the game, where the Vessel Creator establishes some sort of connection with the soul. Number 2, familiarity with the young Kris. This one's murky as all hell. It can only really be speculated about because we know so little about the Vessel Creator's past in Deltarune, but I will put forward a hypothetical. If the Vessel Creator were a tangible, real, non-disembodied character to be found somewhere in hometown, where would they be most likely to be found? Take a moment to think about it. Purely based on vibes, I'd wager 95% of you said one of 3 locations. The shelter, the school, or across the lake / at the source of the mysterious song coming from the deep. The shelter because of its centrality of the plot, its mysterious nature, and the parallels we can draw thematically between it and Undertale's True Lab. The school because if the Vessel Creator is really Gaster, it would make sense narratively if their profession mirrors Alphys's. And across the lake because it's such a glaring unknown that's just as mysterious as our mystery man. One of those, the shelter, we have good reason to believe Kris has had some involvement with in the past, given Monster Kid and Snowy's conversation at the shelter door, plus the shelter door opening for Kris, and Kris's reluctance to let us into the digital version of the shelter. So, with a lot of assuming, we can craft a version of this Vessel Creator that could have conceivably had contact with a young Kris in the shelter. Possible, but largely vibes-based and unsupported by the text. We'll at least say the Vessel Creator isn't ruled out by this criteria, but there's nothing helping their case here either. Number 3, motive for helping or hurting Kris. There's nothing here. We have no insight into any sort of relationship here. Next. Number 4, motive for enabling Kris. This one is interesting. The Vessel Creator has shown some level of investment, detached interest, morbid curiosity in the events currently transpiring. In some manner, the Vessel Creator seems to have some hand in our, the players' involvement in the story via the Vessel creation sequence, which leads to us controlling Kris. In Chapter 3, the Vessel Creator seems to cheer us on in our struggle against the night, and at the end of Chapter 4, the line, "My Deltarune," can be interpreted in so many different ways, ranging from Gaster being the progenitor of the prophecy, to Toby just deciding to break the fourth wall, and thank the player in his spooky, scary, creepy voice. But if the Vessel Creator is invested in how the story of Deltarune is playing out, then enabling one of the major forces of the story, Kris's soul possession and unpossession, certainly tracks. Fair marks overall for the Vessel Creator, and enough threads looping into our picture to make things interesting, but as a bucket theory, it's not too full yet. Egg. That's the best I could come up with for this category because it's the only through line that ties my thoughts together with this candidate. I think most would jump here to call the Forgotten Man my third candidate, and while I don't think they'd necessarily be wrong to do so, I'm not yet ready to make that leap. But the egg scenes bring with them some strong implications, which are: Kris is repressing some memory from their past, which is represented by the Forgotten Man and the scenes surrounding him. Kris sought or was provided psychiatric help, likely to do with whatever event or memory they are suppressing. Both of which lead to Kris going all Lady Macbeth in their art club where they draw pictures and don't kill each other. This creates a hole in the story, a new one, to fill with some unknown person or people, namely, persons involved in Kris's repressed memory, and persons involved in aiding Kris with dealing with that memory. Kris's penchant for removing their soul could be either related to the memory they are repressing, or a method of dealing with that trauma taught to them by someone. With those assumptions, let's look at criteria. Number 1, knowledge of the human soul. No evidence for or against. There's plenty of reason, if we go with a mental health practitioner, they would have the requisite knowledge, but there's nothing here for us yet. Number 2, familiarity with young Kris. This is the strongest connection we have for an egg-related soul sensei. The photocopied runes firmly anchor these memories in Kris's far past. Have you been working out? I guess you grew up. Whatever Kris has been dealing with, the timeline lines up with Noelle's statement. Number 3, motive for helping or hurting Kris. Another strong connection. We know this event had a significant enough impact to spawn the egg rooms. We know someone was trying to help Kris through their issues. Whether helping or hurting, this fits. And number 4, motive for enabling Kris. Nothing. There's nothing to tangibly represent what there is to selfishly gain for this mystery category of person by teaching Kris. Fair marks once again. This picture we're drawing hits to some of the emotional core of Kris, but it ignores the mechanics of the soul and its actual teachings to Kris. It's funny, it's almost the exact opposite to the vessel creator, who had all the marks for the soul knowledge, but none of the emotional core. Gaster egg. Oh, would you look at that? The combination is the best of both, painting a pretty that ties the emotional core to the literal interpretation. Before chapters 3 and 4 came out, this was the full bucket theory that people touted and rallied behind, but it's definitely fallen out of favor since. There's a lot of evidence that the vessel creator and the Forgotten Man are two separate entities, and perhaps even antagonistic to each other. That's part of why I said I wanted to ignore that which bucket is most full thinking. To me, this is a puzzle piece that fits and ties together so many of these lingering threads, and it's an artistic vision of the Deltarune tree that I can see settling into place. The vessel creator, wanting something from the events of the Deltarune prophecy, takes steps to fulfilling it, putting those gears in motion. They position themselves as a person of trust for Kris, like a therapist, another common theory for the identity of the Forgotten Man, taking that opportunity to sow the seeds of the prophecy, and craft for themselves the cage with human soul and parts. Kris, with his knowledge, uses it in a very Kris-like fashion to terrorize Noelle. But that's not to discount our other prime candidate in Carol, or any other potential candidates. I don't think my example proposal is the most likely, or the most well-supported, or even the most cohesive explanation. It's just one amongst many that are fun and interesting to think about. Some way Toby Fox can start to tie the events of the story together as we pass the halfway mark and start looking towards resolutions to the many conflicts and questions he's been posing to us over the course of the first 4 chapters. But what do you think? Did I miss a potential candidate? A crucial piece of evidence for the buckets that disproves the whole thing? The fake out leading into the third possibility doesn't work quite as well on a re-record, so we'll just get right into it. Possibility number 3. Kris saw someone do it, aka Kris is the second soul possession theory. This is the very first thought I had, the one that started me on the rabbit hole of trying to think of other explanations, and really why my brain kept coming back to this flavor text again and again until I put it all into words like this. Kids love to mimic what they see. With their pliant little brains, they suck up everything the adults and older kids in their lives do like sponges, and then they wring themselves out and reproduce those behaviors ad nauseum until they drive everyone around them crazy. If Kris saw someone reach into their chest and pull out a heart-shaped object, that would be a much simpler explanation than someone actively teaching Kris about soul mechanics that they'd need to know in their far-flung future. Kris wouldn't have to know that it was someone's soul. Kris could just see something creepy happen, see a close analog sitting on the Holiday's hallway table, and recreate what they saw, chasing poor Noelle around with it while neither grasped the true existential horror of yanking your font of will and compassion out of your chest and weaponizing it against someone. To me, this idea of Kris just mimicking someone else fits the characterization of the young Kris we've gotten as a rambunctious little menace, out to cause mischief in ways I think will be fun, shaking Ferris wheel cars, flushing bath bombs, convincing your childhood friends that Charles Entertainment Cheese eats children. It doesn't rely on someone foreseeing the need for a human soul-wielding vessel a decade into the future, or some wild coincidence that a coping mechanism turns out to be wildly useful to the evil group chat. But it still leaves us with the question of who. Someone before Kris had a need to rip out their own soul. Let's bring back my favorite thinking tool, some handy-dandy criteria. Number 1, familiarity with young Kris. Gee, this sure sounds familiar. Kris can't copy what they can't see. Number 2, a soul. Bonus points for a red human soul. From Undertale, our assumption is that monster souls are white and heart-shaped, but in Deltarune we've never seen one, nor are they ever really described. The closest we have that I could find is in the first book on souls. It's book 1 about souls. Read it. The soul has long been called many things, the font of our compassion, the source of our will, the container of our life force. But even now, the true function of it is unknown. Nothing there about being specific to human souls, so we can probably assume this book is written by monsters, and that the "our" determiner is being used to refer to either just monsters or monsters and humans. But either way, Rousey helpfully confirms for us that the book holds true for humans regardless of what the monster author's intent was. The second thing I could find to perhaps indicate monsters of heart-shaped souls is from Spamton. All you have to do is show me your heart-shaped object. You're a lightener, aren't you? You've got the light. Why don't you show it off? Spamton spoke like he was after a lightener's soul, not specifically a human's soul. He doesn't ever make a distinction between Kris as a human versus a lightener, so it's possible a monster's heart-shaped object would have been just as good. All that is to say, really the only thing this criteria outright excludes is darkners. Probably. They might have souls too. Now for the softer criteria again. Number 3, a reason to rip their soul out. Even if we assume this isn't a special ability Kris has, that anyone can tear their soul out if they're determined enough to do so, it still doesn't seem like a pleasant enough process that you do so on a whim. Number 4, they're not around anymore. This is sort of a weird one. This is one that I've settled on more from a storytelling and writing perspective than for any strict logical reason. If there were a second person who could tear their soul out from their body in a hometown, who was involved in Kris's life, how would that not have already come up? Wouldn't they be going around closing dark fountains? They're likely to be human, or in possession of a human soul. Wouldn't that person be seen or mentioned at some point already? If there's a second soul ripper, there's probably some reason why they're out of the picture. Now, who are the candidates for who Kris could have seen pulling their soul from their body? Kris's birth parents. These are really the only humans we can be certain actually exist. Let's jump right into the criteria. Number 1, familiarity with a young Kris. Yep, that's an easy W for mom and dad, or NB parents number 1 and number 2. We don't know how old exactly Kris was when the Dreamers adopted them, but Kris's reaction to unfamiliar humans when reading the book How to Take Care of Humans makes me think Kris has some lingering memories of other humans, which could be their parents, which means Kris would have been old enough to see one of their parents yank their soul out for whatever reason. Number 2, a soul. Yep, another W, and human too, colors up in the air, but red could run in the family for all we know. Number 3, a reason to rip their soul out. Truthfully, I got nothing here, L plus ratio parents. And number 4, they're not around anymore. Nothing to say here, Kris's parents are gone, hence the adoption. Well, that was quick and easy. Surely the same will be true of the next candidate. This is one of those situations where the criteria really don't tell the whole story. Factually, Kris's parents make sense. They fit 3 of our 4 bullet points perfectly, but the conclusion is a bit unsatisfying. It doesn't really teach us anything about Kris's past, it doesn't introduce anything we didn't already know. Wow, Kris's parents had human souls, what a twist. And it really didn't answer any of our lingering questions. This is probably the second most boring outcome after it's just something Kris does, and feels like a corollary to it without some satisfying explanation for why one of their parents would rip their soul out. Next candidate. Egg. Well, hello again, nice to see you, hope you've been well. In this form, decidedly ungastery, with an added bonus of human spice thrown into the mix. Particularly with the non-descriptions of the Forgotten Man we've gotten, of the many things we haven't been told, us not being told that the man is a monster man is a glaring one. Freed from the Gaster egg theory bucket, the possibility of the Forgotten Human Man starts to fill our missing segments of the tree quite nicely. Number 1, familiarity with a young Kris. Not going to retread this ground, see our earlier egg discussion. Number 2, a soul. Particularly if we're discussing a potentially human Forgotten Man, this fits our criteria quite nicely. But remember, the egg category is broad and covers anyone involved with Kris's repressed trauma event. Plenty of Lightners with souls of the monster variety could fit this bill too. A catch-all fit, but particularly relevant if we narrow our scope to a human sitting behind the tree. Number 3, a reason to rip their soul out. This one is always tough. It's just difficult to imagine why someone would do it. Even with the example we have, Kris, it's still difficult to parse exactly why Kris sometimes tears us out and sometimes keeps us in, when the opposite in any given situation seems like it'd be the better choice. Why not tear us out when we're psychologically tormenting their classmates, or worse, forcing Kris to pray for Asriel? You put your hands together and said his name, blankly. Why does Kris seem to resent this choice again, and outright resist praying for Noelle even on a non-weird playthrough? I'm getting off track. Number 4, they're not around anymore. If we're talking about the Forgotten Man specifically, I'll count his strange non-existence as not around anymore. For the rest, not so much. Context clues tells us that the rest of the people involved in Kris's past are hometowners, so they're still kicking. Anything that helps us answer questions about this gap in Kris's history and shine a light on the Forgotten Man is a win in my book, but there's some messed up context with this one. If the Forgotten Man really is a source of trauma for Kris, and for some reason Kris witnessed the Forgotten Man tearing his soul from his chest, I think Kris would be less willing to turn that into a form of play acting. It makes me feel like we're still missing something. If we have other options to explore, that's usually a good sign we're barking up the wrong tree. Still, with more context, this could fit, but instead let's consider, finally, at long last, the title of the original video. The second soul possession theory. In this case, the presumption is that Kris is the second person in hometown to be possessed by a soul, either through an external force puppeting their own soul or by accepting a foreign soul into their body. Our candidate is whoever underwent the first soul possession. We're rooting around in the darkness with this one, so to start, let's put to the side needing to justify the first possession's existence. We're looking to this primarily to see how well it fits as an explanation for Kris chasing Noelle around with a soul lookalike, but we'll do some theory bucket filling for this as a treat later, promise. Criteria time. Number 1. Familiarity with young Kris. Unless we dive back into the shelter conspiracy hole, we're not served well starting here, and unlike other times when this criteria has been inconclusive, this time it seems like a more unlikely than so situation for Kris to have happened to associate with whoever has been possessed, unless we can nail down their identity. Poor start. Number 2, a soul. That's better. Someone being possessed by a soul is guaranteed to have a soul, and a human at that if we're talking about a human soul possession. I'll take a truism here, no problem. Number 3, a reason to rip their soul out. This to me is the most appealing reason to fit a second soul possession into this box. It's maybe the only way I can conceivably justify, without any other context or info, why someone would want to rip their soul out. They could have done it simply for the same reasons that Kris does it, to temporarily wrest control of their body from the possessing soul, to act under their own will instead of via an external source of will. And number 4, they're not around anymore. We can do a bit of speculation with this one. If the original soul possessee were still around, why would we, the player, the controller of the Red Heart soul, be involved in the story at all? Why would we be possessing Kris? I can imagine scenarios, both soul possessions being brought about via different methods or by different opposing factions with different goals, but each of these scenarios tends to increase the complexity of the situation. Possible, but definitely inconclusive. Criteria 3 is our only stronghold here, and it's the reason I want to come back to this so that we don't get too mired in the weeds, because there's one more candidate who I'm sure everyone has been screaming at me to mention. December Holiday. Everyone's favorite medieval times cosplaying, wiffle bat swinging, Asriel shirt possessing rock band aficionado who may or may not be speaking to data miners in their dreams. You can't discuss Deltarune's mysteries without talking about everyone's favorite antlered big sister. She's the mystery box and the solution to every theorist's clickbait headlines, the perfect scapegoat appreciator that lets us throw our hands up in the air and call our theories dead ends until Toby drip feeds us some sweet fake posted blog pieces. Let's see which of our requirements Des meets. 1. Familiarity with young Kris. Check. 2. A soul. Check. Not human though, too bad, no bonus points. 3. A reason to rip their soul out. Big X, second soul possession theory stays winning on this one. 4. They're not around anymore. She's the lost girl. She's the first person you thought of when I listed this criteria. Regardless of whether she's the knight or the voice in the code or long dead and buried, for the majority of Hometown, Des ain't exactly around anymore. Possible exceptions being the Doomsday WhatsApp group. And that's it. Not much to say, unfortunately, which kind of brings our analysis to a dead end. The failure to meet criteria 3 unfortunately really hurts the overall picture if we fill our blank in with Des. Too many loose ends not tied up, lack of cohesion, and the fact that she has a monster soul instead of a human one is an unfortunate factor for this candidate unless we consider human Des theory. We're going right off the deep end with this one, so strap in. But first, some disclaimers. The human Des theory bucket is substantially less full than the Des is a deer, obviously bucket. It takes several leaps in logic to conclude that Des is actually a human. The shoes in her room specifically for hooved feet, the antlers in her flashback, and the lack of anyone mentioning Des's humanness, despite that fact being obviously relevant to Kris. Those leaps are someone else's shoes. They're in a box full of stuff that definitely isn't all hers. Kris's horns too, so she could be wearing a headband. And no one wants to talk about Des at all, so her being human wouldn't have come up. If, and only if, we make those leaps, then we can fill in our human Des theory bucket with the pile of very regular looking shoes in her closet, the human soul shaped objects in her closet, and some cherry picked and questionably canon Undertale dialogue. Thankfully, Des actually being human isn't pivotal to what I really want to talk about, which is Des is a candidate for being both the original soul possessee and the person Kris saw pulling their soul from their chest. Des being human is just some added spice that ties things together a little bit neater. Back to the criteria, and just like with who could have taught Kris, this time we get to combine the best of two candidates together. 1. Familiarity with a young Kris. Check, again. 2. A soul. Human this time, since we can assume the soul Des would be possessed by is human. This is why human Des is a bit neater than monster Des for this circumstance. We don't have to explain why Des can hold a human soul without issue, but we can just as easily envision a world where monster Des holds a human soul for some time, and everything seems fine, and then in a true lab amalgamate situation, things go wrong and that's how she ends up as a lost girl. But focusing on our little blank space on the canvas, human Des is a cleaner way to connect these lines together. The bucket's still rickety and full of holes though. 3. A reason to rip their soul out. A worthwhile candidate for a solid criteria 3. If Des is possessed by a soul, ripping it out comes with all the reasons and justifications Kris has. And 4. They're not around anymore. And now we're at a solid 4 for 4 on our criteria. With all that in mind, before we conclude with our soul puppeted friend here, let's jump back to what I promised earlier, justification for the second soul possession theory in the first place, with the context of Des, human or monster, as a potential first possessee. The first thing I want to touch on is the prophecy, specifically the first hero, the cage with human soul and parts. There's been a lot of discussion about how well the Fun Gang correlate to the three described heroes, with a vast majority of it surrounding the second hero, the girl. But plenty of time and thought and discussion has gone into imagining an original three heroes predating our Fun Gang, and a second soul possession, a second cage with human soul and of human death's parts slots right in. Next is Carol's strange interest with the human soul. My mom just collects heart pillows for some reason, combined with what could be pillows but look distinct from Carol's in Des's closet. The ones in Des's closet are peculiar simply due to their location. They're really thrown all the way back into the closet, judging by the closet always being open on the right-hand door, like she regularly acquired and then threw these objects deep into the closet, shoved against and stacked on top of one another, kind of like how Kris always disposes of their own red soul. Another connection between Des and Hearts comes from the lyrics of the Guitar Hero song in Chapter 3, Raise Up Your Bat, which, while not likely written by Des, is inextricably tied to her by Tenna's dialogue in the scene prior. The last line is particularly Des-tied by the lyrics fitting the motif of Lost Girl, a theme that also heavily represents Des. The first line mentioning a demon heart is also notable, however, because we know Kris and Caddy at one point allegedly tried to summon a demon when they were kids, representing a potential origin to another heart-shaped soul and potentially an opposite to the player-represented angel soul, but that's way, way, way off topic at this point and a subject of plenty of other videos. Then, if you believe Des is the knight, we can go to the knight's design. There have been some comparisons made about Kris's posing and actions being mirrored by the roaring knight, particularly one on Reddit by the user longjumpingbit9359 that shows a handful, but I've been thinking more about this, the knight's sort of evasive ball-like form. It's very similar to how the soul reacts when Kris is threatened outside of combat, the size seems right, the rapid movement and the spitting pattern, it all seems a bit suspicious. Lastly, I want to talk about Dragon Blazers, and the references to it throughout the game. I'm going to speed through this, there are plenty of deep dives out there regarding this topic. We know from Susie talking to Gerson that Dragon Blazers is based on the prophecy, though some of the things have been changed. We know from Noelle's blog describing the cross-shaped maze rooms that the S-rank games are, at least in part, representative of Dragon Blazers, and by extension, the prophecy. We know the White Hood is representative of Noelle, because the White Hood has the same ability to intuit their way through the maze, thereby leading us through it, and due to the alternate placeholder sprite for the White Hood being named OBJ Board Enemy Deer, plus her ice magic. So if the White Hood represents Noelle, reasonably, we can assume that the black goat monster that mirrors our movements represents Des. This goat monster, when flipping an inaccessible Toriel variable in the code, assigned to the entity named OJ Board Enemy Black Deer, uses a black deer sprite as this unused alternate. On top of that, Susie, when talking about Dragon Blazers 2, all the way back in Chapter 2, mentions how your sister gets cursed. The reason this black goat monster representing Des is important is because as soon as you enter that room, the soul is in control of that monster. As much as we are possessing Mini Kris, we are also possessing this Mini Des, and once the two are no longer separated, our control prioritizes Mini Des over Mini Kris, with Mini Kris acting outside of our control to strike Des down as soon as she gets close. I said I didn't want to fall into the theory bucket filling trap, but looking at this script, this whole section has been just that. I want to try and rein this back in and try and look at why any of this matters, because what definitely doesn't matter is which of these scenarios I've spent the last 30 minutes or so going over is the most likely, or what's really going to happen. What matters is the exercise, taking the time and effort to digest and appreciate the media you're enjoying. For me, I needed to talk about this flavor text, and I'm not quite done yet, because after all, I haven't finished painting our version of the tree I mentioned. We talked about the facts and figures, the literal and the evidence, but ultimately what matters to me is how we connect that with what our author, Toby Fox, is trying to tell us. Themes, the theoretical vegetables. We've had our junk food theorizing, now it's time for a bit of thematic analysis so we can feel the content we just spent the last 34 minutes on wasn't pure brain rot. But this part can be boring, so instead of throwing Subway Surfers up on the screen to keep you engaged, how about instead you watch me no-hitting the night while I originally gathered footage for this video? What are we told within the first 5 minutes of launching Deltarune? No one gets to choose who they are in this world. No one gets to choose who they are or how the world views them. You don't have the agency to influence yourself, let alone the world around you. That's the external, antagonistic force acting on the characters in Deltarune. You don't get to keep your wonderful vessel. Instead, you get to tear Kris's control of their own body away from them. Then Susie tells you again, no choices, no determinations to be made, because she feels just as trapped, just as helpless in a life with that agency stripped from her. Rousey comes along and tells us that our journey is foretold by an unchangeable prophecy, and so on and so forth. Every chapter, the characters face an overwhelming sense of inevitability, an inability to change the course of their fate. I could probably make a whole other video on this, but I think the central thread or theme tying Deltarune's chapters together right now is an exploration of where the line is between a healthy and an unhealthy way of rebelling against the Force, which says you don't get to choose who you are. We see the healthy, we see Susie finding a place where she feels like she can belong and doesn't have to keep up her tough exterior, and we see Rousey propped up by his friend's insistence that his opinions and feelings matter. But we also see a hell of a lot more unhealthy ways of coping with that seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Asgore's unwillingness to accept the end of his marriage, driving him not only to further alienate himself from his family, but to also inflict some amount of psychological unease on his child. Rousey's utter lack of perceived self-worth, his willingness to sacrifice every amount of his own agency and happiness in order to appease others in the hopes the fate will change. Berdly struggling internally to maintain his own sense of smarts and self-worth and attempting to project it externally by refusing the help of those he deems of lesser intelligence while heavily leaning on the one person he views as smarter than himself. The Weird Route, which is an entire perversion of the game's events where you try to wrest control of the narrative by subjugating its characters, and that's without touching on nearly every one of the game's chapter end and secret bosses. But why does this matter when looked at alongside of all of our theorizing from the rest of this video? Because with this in mind, we can ask ourselves how any of these possibilities fits into this, or other thematic through lines that pervade Deltarune. If Carol or the Vessel Creator taught Kris about tearing out their soul at a young age, what fate were they trying to change? And are the consequences from that teaching going to mark this as a healthy or an unhealthy way of doing so? Could their attempts have caused whatever tragedy Kris is still dealing with today, or be the reason why Des is lost to them? Were they trying to disrupt the prophecy at any expense to themselves like Rousey? If Des was the first hometowner possessed by a human soul, is Kris just another repeated attempt, the same method with the same doomed outcome, like Asgore trying desperately to fix his marriage with another bouquet of flowers doomed to blossom in the garbage can? How do Kris, Rousey, and Susie avert tragedy without spawning something even greater? Next up is the math video, where I primarily interrogate Kris and Carol's relationship and who she's addressing when she says, "You are welcome here anytime." There will not be a single number or variable in this video. Math is so much more than the arithmetic that likely comes to your mind when I say the word math. Math is also logic, the process by which we construct arguments and determine truth. Not truth as in the opposite of lying, like you or I would think of it, but certainty within the confines of the laid out assumptions. There are many ways to arrive at a certainty in the context of math. You've likely heard of a mathematical proof before. One of them, and the one I'll be using for the majority of this video, is called proof by contradiction. This proof has you assume that the thing you want to prove is actually false. Then, you show why this thing being false breaks some other fundamental fact. You create a contradiction, and therefore show that the thing can't be false and must be true. This type of proof is especially useful if you want to prove that something is not the case, as proving a negative is usually a trickier task than proving a positive. It's easier with an example. Let's say that you want to prove Carol is not the Roaring Knight. If we're to prove it by a contradiction, we start by assuming Carol is the knight, and see where that takes us. Kris and Susie encounter Carol in her home. They walk straight to the church and encounter the Roaring Knight, without seeing Carol anywhere along the way. This creates a contradiction. For Carol to be in the church before Kris and Susie, she would have had to have passed Kris and Susie along the way. This is a proof by contradiction, that Carol is not the knight. Hold your comments, I can feel the anger radiating from you already. Of course, this isn't a rigorous and thorough proof. There's still a chance Carol is the knight, but that's because we haven't done our due diligence in setting up the assumptions and conditions necessary to construct a mathematical proof within the confines of something as fluid and chaotic as a fictional story. We need to agree on some ground rules first. Some base assumptions that, for now, we're just assuming to be true. They could be false. These assumptions don't have any logical structure supporting them. They're just a baseline that is generally agreeable so that we can begin our proving. So, let's assume, for the moment, 1. There aren't any features in Hometown's layout that we as the players are unaware of. There's no hidden tunnel between the holiday home and the church. There's no path through the woods. The screen transitions aren't hiding any lengthy maze-like streetways. 2. There aren't any fundamental rules of the Deltarune universe that we're unaware of. Lightners can't travel between dark worlds like Rousey can. Deer monsters don't secretly have the ability to teleport. 3. The writing of Deltarune is generally consistent and accounts for the player's choices outside of dialogue and menu choices. This isn't a plot hole Toby didn't consider. Kris and Susie visiting the Dreamer house and discovering Toriel missing isn't what canonically happens. Any big surprises are foreshadowed by Toby, and he isn't going out of his way to lie to or trick the player. This is our framework. It's the rules of the world we're assuming for now, because making assumptions like these is the only way to start reasoning our way through the darkness. But us assuming these things doesn't make them true. It just means that if the above 3 things are true, Carol being the Roaring Knight creates a contradiction, and therefore, if these things are true, Carol is not the Knight. But this framework is just assumptions. There's no inherent truth to it. If we want to prove 2 + 2 = 5, we can do so. If we invent a framework wherein the set of rules dictate that every addition secretly adds an extra 1 to it. In the same way, if Carol being the Knight causes a contradiction, we can reevaluate our premises instead of declaring the statement false. Maybe you think it's likely that the shelter is connected to the mayor's home. It would make sense in an emergency situation to ensure the politician's safety. And so to you, it's more likely that the premise is faulty than my proven statement, and that's completely valid. With that out of the way, let's examine the question I ultimately want to figure out the answer to. How much does Carol Holiday actually know? To elaborate, how much of Kris's and the Soul's activities is Carol aware of? Does she know that Kris is possessed? Is she aware that Kris has been tearing their soul from their body? That Kris and the Soul are currently in some way antagonistic to each other? These questions seem like they have an obvious answer, but I promise you, pretty quickly, the obvious answers start to run into contradictions elsewhere. So stick with me for a bit and give me a chance to go through everything. A proof by contradiction. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, the obvious answer to the question. Carol knows pretty much everything. Either Carol is a mastermind behind whatever plot is hatching between the anti-fun gang, or directly in contact with the mastermind and is fully aware of their plans. She also is tuned into Kris's mental and physical state, either being a reason behind the soul possession, or simply aware of their current struggle and the reason why it's happening. For the sake of ease, I'll call this possibility the Mastermind Carol timeline, but it encompasses all the previous possibilities. It's just reliant on her knowing every step in the plan, not necessarily being the one who came up with it. Let's lay out a Mastermind Carol timeline of events. Before day 1. Whatever happens to Kris that has them take possession of the Red Heart Soul, Carol is aware of it, sees it happen, or orchestrates it. Maybe Carol is the second voice in the vessel creation sequence. Maybe Kris confides in her because they need her passkey to the shelter. Maybe the Knight clues her into the plans after wrapping Kris up in the ordeal. It doesn't matter. Whatever happens, Carol knows enough about it to orchestrate her plans. Day 1. The player takes control of the soul in the morning of the first day. This is an important milestone. We don't know about any of the other events that transpired prior to this moment, beyond what we've been told by other characters. We have to assume that Kris and Carol are both aware of this fact and are relying on this remaining true since they have not clued us into their plans. Day 2. Someone opens the second dark fountain, and Carol knows who opened it. Kris opens the third dark fountain. Kris asks Tenna to delay the Fun Gang until the Roaring Knight arrives. Day 3. The Fun Gang encounters the entity referred to as the Roaring Knight. This entity, right here, who from now on I will simply refer to as the Roaring Knight, or the Knight, but whose identity is only given by the UI and by other characters who are either prone to lying or being wrong. And the UI has lied to us before, but I'm not getting into it now. Kris throws the fight if needed. The Roaring Knight takes some ambiguous action against Toriel and captures Undyne, taking her to the shelter. At the shelter, someone inside opens the door for Kris, at which point the player's POV is cut, disallowing us from seeing who's inside or where Kris goes. The Soul attempts to read the shelter code inside the guitar, which Kris prevents. Kris is told that Kris needs the soul in the Dark Worlds, presumably for a task like closing dark fountains or destroying titans. Kris is told to keep Susie away from the guitar. Susie retrieves the guitar. Kris calls Carol, who arrives and takes the guitar from Susie before she can read the code. As Kris is leaving, Carol stops them and tells Kris that you are welcome here anytime, in bright red, all caps text. And we can stop there, since we can't really derive anything from events that happen after Carol's last appearance. Those of you who like to fixate on the same things I do might already be catching what I'm getting at, but let's do our due diligence. What are the base assumptions we're working off here? First, we're going to reuse some from earlier, and we'll shortcut them so that they're a bit easier to talk about. 1. There aren't any fundamental rules we're unaware of, and 2. Deltarune makes sense. And we acknowledge that these assumptions are only being held to for their relevance in the how much does Carol Holiday actually know discussion. There are clearly rules about the world that we're unaware of, but that doesn't mean they'll be relevant to this mystery we're solving. They might be, and we might get to that later. For now, we're assuming these are true because to do otherwise means we can't proceed with our reasoning. Let's add a couple of assumptions for this particular Carol mastermind timeline. 3. When Carol says you, she is referring to the soul or the player, not to Kris. And 4. Carol is being honest when she welcomes you back anytime. We'll reverse the first of those assumptions later. The second is, again, just something we have to take as truth, because otherwise, the scene doesn't mean anything and our speculation ends. For now, let's look at our timeline and see where our contradiction is already forming, starting from the very end of it. Carol welcomes the soul/player to return to her home. The red flags should immediately be shooting up, based on what happened immediately prior to this welcome. Carol asks Kris to keep Susie away from the guitar, to keep her from learning the code, and does not mention keeping the soul away. Kris tries to keep Susie and the soul/player from the guitar, to keep them from learning the code. Carol welcomes the soul back anytime, risking the soul having another opportunity to see the guitar and learn the code. If Carol knows that Kris is trying to keep the soul away from the guitar, why would she welcome the soul back to her home? Clearly, Kris believes the soul learning the code needs to be prevented, either because it poses the same threat Susie learning the code does, or because the soul could somehow tell Susie, we can enter codes after all, as seen by the parental locks in Chapter 3. If Carol knows about Kris's and the soul's full dynamic, she would know about the antagonistic relationship, and either tell Kris not to hamper the soul if it's not a problem, or take the same steps to keep the soul away as she has Susie. This is a contradiction, so either we declare the Carol mastermind timeline false, or we modify our assumptions. 3. When Carol says you, she's referring to Kris, not to the soul or the player. Let's go through that same series of events. Carol asks Kris to keep Susie away from the guitar, to keep her from learning the code, does not mention keeping the soul away. Kris tries to keep Susie and the soul/player from the guitar, to keep them from learning the code. Carol welcomes Kris back anytime, safe in the knowledge that Kris can keep the hostile soul from learning the code. This time, we have to ask why all of the phone voice lines that reference the guitar only mention Susie. If Kris needs to be reminded that Susie can't get the guitar, wouldn't they also need to be reminded not to let the soul get it? The only soul mention is in a message relating to the Dark Worlds, and Kris needing it. We've hit another contradiction, but there's a bigger issue than that with this scenario. Why the big red text if there's no bigger implication? In the words of legendary wordsmith Andrew Cunningham, if an author writes a word in all caps and bright red text like a Sans remembers your genocide meme, they might be trying to tell you something. So we're locking this criteria into a middle ground for the future. When Carol says you, she is not referring to Kris. The generality of the statement I'll expand on later. So, Carol, or the shadowy orchestrator of her actions, isn't an all-knowing mastermind. What could she be missing? The neglectful Carol. This version of Carol is aware of Kris's actions, but doesn't know about Kris's antagonistic relationship with their soul, and doesn't recognize the internal struggle Kris is dealing with, and as long as events move smoothly, she assumes everything is fine and that the soul is performing its function as a tool for Kris with no friction or interference. Everything about our timeline works. Until we get to the phone call, Specifically the line, "Without soul, Kris will." And, "Kris, dark world, no soul, can't." None of these are relevant to Kris if Kris isn't regularly removing their soul. If Carol were unaware that Kris's relationship with their soul is rocky, why would she feel the need to specify this to Kris? This doesn't fit either. I could continue with minor variations of this and pad out watch time for ages. Instead, I'll cut it short. You can find small contradictions in Carol's or Kris's actions based on which knowledge you assume is missing from either. If Carol knows less, the statements regarding the church tonight and the police sacrifice next week just don't track. If Carol knows more, her welcoming in a rogue, hostile element becomes an unnecessary and contradictory risk. So how do we reconcile this and avoid a contradiction? In my opinion, we have to assume Carol thinks she knows more than she does. Carol is wrong. She's mistaken, or she's been tricked. The double-crossed Carol. Here we go. Welcome to the meat of the video. Strap in. Let's imagine you are a Carol who thinks she is the mastermind. Everything is going according to plan. Dark fountains are being opened and closed. Undyne has been captured. The church is ready to have a dark fountain opened in it, and you get a call from Kris's number. It's your loyal compatriot. Susie and Noelle are in your living room, and your ally informs you that Susie is looking for the code, a threat to the shelter. But everything's okay. Your ally tells you that they're the one who's been tasked with the code's retrieval, and they can sandbag the task and fail, with Susie none the wiser. So you decide to return to your preparations. A short time later, another dial from Kris's number. Susie has the guitar. A threat has become a crisis. Susie has to keep believing your ally is aiding her. They can't seize the guitar back openly. You return home just in time and retrieve the guitar. Your ally has done well to help avert the crisis. A pat on the back, a kind word. And while Noelle, Susie, and Asgore are nearby, you can't be too explicit about it, but a signal, a note, that they are welcome here anytime is in order, because you're not speaking to Kris right now. You haven't been since long before day 1 in our timeline. Your ally has been the soul the whole time, not Kris, at least as far as you knew. Now, imagine you're Kris. An indeterminate amount of time before day 1 in the hometown shelter, you're possessed by a hostile soul, either your own being controlled by someone else, or your soul replaced with another's. We'll call this being the demon soul. Control of your body has been taken from you totally and completely. A flesh puppet on strings, the puppeteer, the demon soul, having you dance to the whim of Mayor Carol Holiday. You've no choice but to bide your time for an opening to free yourself while Carol and the soul communicate via phone call every night, diligently deleting the call records every time. But you've a flying ace up your sleeve. Someone taught you how to, or you saw someone before you pull a soul from a human body. Day 1 rolls around. This is your chance. The plan's being enacted, and you're constantly on the lookout to wrest some freedom away from your occupier. But there's been a change. Your actions are less purposeful. The soul is looking through your drawers, at your bed, inspecting everything like it's never seen any of it before. When Toriel takes you to school, it doesn't immediately rush to the Dark Fountain to accomplish its task. You're going to class? Why? This wasn't the plan Carol told the Demon Soul. Something's gone awry, but as fate would have it, still, you end up sealing the first fountain. Maybe Susie was or wasn't part of the original plan Carol had, but that's what she's dealing with now. It's time to check in, but the soul either doesn't want to, or doesn't know how to, call Carol. You have to do it. But now there's a problem. Your voice is wrong. When the soul has been controlling you, your voice is gravelly, distant, like it's coming from a speaker. You tear the soul from your chest when you realize this might work. You aura farm a little to show the soul who's really in charge, then you make the call. You use what you've learned to impersonate the demon soul from the days before, and with your phone on speaker mode, you hope Carol doesn't notice the difference. You already know the plan. Computer lab Dark World, than one in your own home. You worry that if Carol catches on, she'll learn that you've been partially freed and find a way to return the soul back to its demonic origin, so you go along with it. Safe in the knowledge that the elusive mayor is hard to reach most days, and the soul doesn't know her number after all. Clearing your history has worked in keeping it in the dark. Day 3 rolls around. Undine was taken by the night. Susie and the soul are trying to find a way into the shelter to save her. Carol doesn't want Susie getting in the shelter, and you desperately do not want the soul getting in either, just in case something in there can turn it back to normal. After all, that's where this all started. You need to keep both of them away. You can handle the soul, but if Susie learns you're working with Carol, everything falls apart. You've come to really love the Fun Gang, you don't want to betray them. Someday you'll find the right way to explain everything. Maybe they'll help you. But right now, you know too much. It sounds too weird, and you've already lied so much. Will they be able to forgive you? Sorry, that really turned into some self-indulgent fanfiction writing there, didn't it? But we've woven around the contradictions with this one. Not only that, it provides some good answers to the questions our previous contradictions brought up. Why would Carol be welcoming an element hostile to her plans into her home? Because she fully believes the entity she's speaking to is her ally, and has been faithfully executing her plans. Why does Kris keep the soul away from the guitar? Because the soul reaching the shelter poses a potential threat to their freedom. Further, this points to why Kris resisted us entering the digital version of the shelter. It's a fear response. Fear of the demon soul's return. Why does Kris keep Susie away from the guitar? Because Kris needs to appear like they're still possessed by the demon soul, and follow Carol's orders, or Carol will find a way to tear what little freedom Kris has away from them. But that's not all. This potential timeline of events would go a long ways towards answering many of the lingering questions we've had since Chapter 1. Why does Kris hide things from us, act against us, and not just talk to us and explain their predicament? Because Kris already had an antagonistic relationship with the soul inhabiting their body before we connected to it. If we were to learn the whole story, who's to say we wouldn't make the same choices and subjugate Kris as the demon soul did? Kris doesn't know why the behavior of the soul changed. They have no way to know that we aren't a demon. Well, at least sometimes we aren't. Why does Kris act like a zombie, shuffling around, intimidating us with their knife, all while they're clearly capable of behaving normally with us torn out? To keep the being they have full reason to believe is the demon soul in line. They're using the behavior they practiced on Noelle, spooking her with scary pranks, hiding under the bed, acting like a horror movie monster, just in case the soul they clearly can't trust wants to try something. Why is Kris going out of their way to create dark fountains, despite the fact that they're risking the end of the world? Because to act against it would immediately clue Carol into the fact that they have the freedom to do so. Who knows? Maybe Kris is even confident enough upon hearing Carol's entire plan that the roaring won't end up happening, and so is willing to take the risk to further some other goal. For bonus points, it also clears up a minor wrinkle I have with the phrasing of the lines in the phone call I brought up earlier. Why would Carol be referring to Kris in the third person here? Why not, without soul, you will? Because as far as Carol knows, she isn't talking to Kris. She's talking to the demon soul, her co-conspirator. And since Kris is communicating over speakerphone, Carol is none the wiser that Kris is using their normal voice, not the soul-possessed speaker voice. So we got this far. What now? Well, unfortunately for the foundation of this video, not finding a contradiction isn't a valid mathematical proof. We could endlessly list various ways this model doesn't break the story of Deltarune, but no amount of demonstration can prove positively, even within the bounds of our assumptions, that double-cross Carol is a correct read on Toby's plans for the future. We have stacks of evidence, but what is evidence? Really, what does that word mean? And how does your average Deltarune theorist, which I guess includes me now, use the word? How can you provide evidence that a statement is true? For example, all ravens are black. Simple. You start rounding up ravens, and make sure that none of them are any color other than black. But in this world of arbitrary math problems, Sometimes restrictions exist. And for now, we can't go bird catching. What then? All non-black things are non-ravens. This statement, and all ravens are black, are, from a logical standpoint, equivalent. This should make sense intuitively to some extent. If all ravens are black, then anything that isn't black can't be a raven. Proving this flipped statement would be a proof by the contrapositive of the original statement, all ravens are black. How would you provide evidence that non-black things are non-ravens? You could present a red apple or a white sports car. Any non-black thing that is not a raven is in some way evidence towards proving your claim. Why? Because if you couldn't gather ravens, but you could gather every single non-black thing in the universe, you could definitively say the ravens are black. If among all of those non-black things, you found not a single raven, so one item among that sea of near infinite non-black things is the tiniest portion of evidence towards proving ravens are black. This is what's known as the Raven Paradox, or often Hempel's ravens. It's a conflict between what we as humans intuit about what evidence is and how it's used to prove what's true in our lives, versus how logical statements can sometimes take that to its extreme. A paradox that was infamously and brutally butchered by one particular murder mystery visual novel. And it's not an unresolved paradox, but resolving it involves looking at evidence not as a binary yes or no, is it evidence or is it not? You have to think for yourself how meaningful the evidence is. In absence of black ravens, what multitude of objects... Sorry, what were we talking about again? Deltarune? Originally, my plan with the script was to be cheeky and end the video there, but after going through and editing, I think this is worth saying instead of just leaving to implication. Theories, not just my double-crossed Carol proposition, but most Deltarune theories out there, are propped up on evidence like this. Double-crossed Carol is a theory of black ravens that I presented a lot of yellow bananas, blue pianos, and pink ducks, enough that I've taken the collective as a convincing premise for me, personally, but I haven't found any black ravens to show, nor is there no chance of a white raven showing up in Chapter 5 to strike the theory dead. That's the nature of these things, and why it's fun to put these out into the world. But when people's thresholds for a convincing argument and the nature of evidence they're willing to accept differs, it can lead to some pretty disheartening statements. People don't believe X after all this evidence, it's proof that media literacy is failing. If Y is true, then it's bad writing because look at all this foreshadowing. You're delusional if you think there's any evidence backing up Z. When in 99% of cases when people direct these statements at other people, it's because they differ not in intelligence or amount of engagement and thought. It's because they differ in the base premise of what is evidence and how much that evidence is worth to them. I saw plenty of these types of insults on social media and elsewhere before my first video, but seeing some of that in the comments of the second soul possession theory video was pretty sad, honestly. Even when I tried to bundle in the message about not being antagonistic to the author and other readers, you can direct all that at me. I don't mind if you think I'm delusional, but try not to throw those comments at other people down in the box down there or elsewhere. There's just no need for it. Thanks for watching. Now let's take a look at why Asgore might have been kicked off the police force, and why despite all that, Carol still keeps him around. Before we get started, I want to introduce an element to this video that will help us keep things moving and keep the length of this video down a bit. This is the speculation meter. It's going to monitor the video and show with its tracking lancer just how speculative the words I'm saying are. It has 3 levels. The first is mostly factual. When the lancer is here, what is being said is generally one-for-one something being directly said by a character in Deltarune, and I'm probably including the moment it's being said in the footage for the video. There's still always the chance the character is wrong, lying, or joking when they say it, but to my best judgment, when the lancer is here, the character is speaking honestly and truthfully. The second lancer level is dot connecting. This is when I'm drawing what I believe to be a reasonable conclusion directly from the facts that we have, drawing the lines between the dots to form some picture. This is one layer of speculation down. It's speculation based on facts or really strong feelings that I think the majority of the community would agree with. The final level is basically fanfiction. This is dot connecting my dot connecting, speculation on speculation. It's 2 or more layers deep into my own bullshit that I do honestly believe in, but requires some level of suspension of disbelief to accept as part of the theorizing. When the Lancer is here, you should take anything I say with a grain of salt. With that out of the way, let's go over what we know, starting with the facts we know about the hometown police force. Nothing ever happens in hometown. Crime isn't an issue, police just direct traffic and help people out of trees. They're a token government body that doesn't need to exist, except Carol doesn't need the police to do ordinary police stuff, because Carol is apparently a crime-fighting badass. In fact, it's argued that the police are more likely to get in the way and make the town less safe than they are to perform normal police duties competently. Fewer explosions, fewer mistaken crimes, fewer arrests without Undyne. Instead, Carol needs the police, specifically the police chief, to hold on to one of the 3 shelter codes. And this is a responsibility that Carol does make use of, because Alphys has seen her and Carol at the shelter together at least once, and Alphys, from all indications, is one of the newer folk to hometown, seeing as this NPC mentions they're hiring by Kris's mom, and Undyne still not knowing Alphys' name. That's what we know about the police. Undyne is the current police chief, and her primary responsibility is holding on to a code that apparently frightens even her. Next, let's go over what we know about Asgore. Asgore was removed from the force. That wording is specific and important. Asgore didn't quit in shame or feel pressured by the public. He was removed, against his will, from his post as police chief, presumably by a higher-ranking government official with the power to do so, who as far as we know is only Mayor Carol Holiday. Some event occurred involving Asgore which caused him to lose everything: his family, his job, the respect of his peers. Henceforth, referred to as the incident. This has warped Asgore's life into an obsession over the incident, seeing as his car and business are littered with evidence of his obsession, an obsession so strong Kris shows signs of trauma relating to seeing things that evoke their father's investigation. This obsession with the incident has drawn Asgore into a self-delusional state where he believes that if others, particularly Toriel's, understanding of the incident were consistent with his own, that he'd have his life, family, and job back, if only they knew that the incident was caused by him just wanting to protect everyone. Other things we know about Asgore: Rudy and Carol are supportive of Asgore, quite literally sporting the only slightly ambiguous you-know-what, and driving business directly to his Flower King shop, despite, as we established earlier, Carol necessarily having been involved in his firing. Additionally, we know Asgore comes into the church at night to pray for Kris, Ezreal, Toriel, Rudy, and his flowers. Remember that list because I'll bring it back up later. In summary for Asgore, he is obsessed with the incident which ruined his life and took his job and family from him, and is desperate to set the record straight and get all of the above back with the aid of Carol and Rudy. Finally, let's look at Carol. Carol as a mayor has negative riz but is still somehow able to run unopposed every year for hometown mayor because she works hard, has a good track record, and apparently uses her katana to ensure no crime ever happens in hometown. Carol is also an owner of one of the 3 shelter keys. Carol is obsessed with preserving things as they are and keeping them safe. Dessa's bedroom has been kept just the way she left it, with no one allowed inside. Noelle's snowflakes have been bronzed and preserved on the wall despite it making her cry. And according to multiple people, she keeps everything important at home for extra security. Whatever she's been up to lately, whether that's conspiring with Kris or the night or really just preparing for the festival, isn't important for what comes next. Cutting that down, Carol is a badass, beloved mayor who has an obsessive need to keep things exactly as they are. Where am I going with all this? Let's use this starting point. The conclusion that Carol is keeping the role of police chief around primarily to safeguard one of the shelter codes. Now let's jump to the incident. Asgore made some mistake that got him removed as chief of the police force, which sent his life spiraling. If our conclusion from before is correct, we can safely assume that the incident wasn't some mistake born from crime fighting, since that isn't really the police's job in hometown. Instead, it'd have to either be something we'd expect from a police officer unrelated to crime, like solving a missing persons case, or something specific to hometown's police chief, which would be the shelter code. In my opinion, one of these is more likely than the other, due to what we know about Carol and Asgore's current relationship. If Asgore was removed for botching a missing persons case, it would almost certainly have to have been Dessa's from a storytelling perspective, but we know Carol employs and enables Asgore, uses her power to support his business, trusts him in her home, and has involved him to some degree in her inner circle, all of which is inconsistent with the idea of Asgore having made a big enough error while trying to solve Dess's disappearance to warrant his full-on removal from the Force, a removal that in all likelihood had to come from Carol herself. On top of that, remember who Asgore has been praying for: Kris, Asriel, Toriel, Rudy, and his flowers. Notably absent is one December holiday, who Asgore would definitely be praying for if he was feeling substantial guilt over botching her missing persons case. If instead Asgore did something he wasn't supposed to do with his shelter code, he's violated the only reason Carol keeps the police around, warranting his removal from his position while still leaving open the door for Carol trusting Asgore with personal tasks, as it would have been a betrayal of his position as police chief, not of Carol's personal trust in his handling of her missing daughter. So what could Asgore have done with a shelter key that would warrant not only his removal, but his entire life falling apart? Well, what do we know about the shelter keys? We know one is held by each of the current police chief, Mayor Holliday, and someone linked to the church or the Deltarune, whose exact identity isn't important for this discussion. And as far as we know, the only use for them is to open the hometown shelter, a task frightening enough to make even Undyne nervous and to scare the school children silly. If Asgore misused his shelter key, then what must be true? We know Asgore must have used it to open the shelter door, the only purpose we're aware of, and so we also know that all 3 keys must have been used. But that creates a conflict. If all 3 keys were used, then Carol would have had to have been present and aware of what's happening. That's inconsistent with Carol then promptly removing Asgore from the Force, seeing as she was aware of and complicit in Asgore's actions. So what's our resolution? In my opinion, what's likely is that Asgore stole Carol's shelter key, and maybe even the shelter key of the 3rd unknown key holder. Asgore stole the keys to the shelter to open it. He did so in an attempt to protect everyone, and as a result, Carol removed him from the Force and he lost everything, an act for which Asgore doesn't personally blame her for, as he still treats her as a friend. So that's the theory as it stands. Permit me a little bit of embellishing on this tale, some fluff to fill in some of the gaps here that I think this straightforward presentation doesn't fully fill out. Carol was the hometown mayor. Just as it is now, her job was to handle exceptional crises as they occurred, and one just occurred. Her daughter Des has gone missing. She organized a search effort, an effort manifesting, among much else, in a corkboard in her home that she has preserved as is to this very day, as is her nature, seeing as the case is still unsolved. Asgore, the police chief, unsatisfied with merely acting as a figurehead chief in charge of one measly code, which of course he'd be. He loves the idea of an old western sheriff taking the law into his own hands. It's great TV. So he begins to dig where he shouldn't, into the possibility of Des being stuck in the hometown shelter. Maybe he was spurned into doing so by Kris's account of the place. Maybe they believe she's in there too even, and that there's something dangerous inside. So Asgore comes to Carol and begs, "Please, let's just check the shelter. I know you're sure it hasn't been opened, but I have a bad feeling about the place." And Carol refuses, her controlling nature assuring herself that it would only be a waste of time and unnecessarily disrupt the preservation of the town's emergency shelter. So, with Asgore convinced that the shelter poses a threat to Des, to the whole town even, Asgore takes it upon himself to steal Carol's shelter code, and either convince a 3rd key holder to assist him, or steal theirs as well, and open the shelter door. When he does so, inside is the brutal truth. Asgore was right. He's met with some unspeakable horror, something outlandish and unbelievable if not seen with your own eyes, something not unlike a dark world. Asgore flees. He rushes back to Carol and comes clean about stealing the codes. She's furious as he stumbles and tries to explain what he saw, but in the end he knows it's no good. They need to see it for themselves. He drags the mayor to the shelter, hollering about the danger, calling for the aid of the able-bodied in the town to confront the terror within. The 3 key holders approach the door. Unlock. Unlock, unlock, open. Nothing. Just an ordinary emergency shelter. The terrifying world that Asgore saw is gone. The shame and embarrassment Asgore feels is overwhelming and crippling. Even if Carol were to accept that Asgore believes what he says and that he did what he did out of the goodness of his heart, there's no way with how everything's gone down that Carol can let Asgore keep his position. But Asgore can never let it go. He knows what he saw. He saw the horrific truth, and he knows that if he doesn't put everything he has into proving what he saw was real, he'll never be able to undo the torturous pain inflicted upon him on that day. Thanks so much for watching this quote-unquote mini theory. This video was an experiment to see if I could make a condensed video under 5 minutes long that still felt complete and thorough. That experiment was a failure, but it's still significantly shorter than my first two videos, though even at 10 minutes there were still things I wish I could have covered in more detail. Let me know what you think. The ideas I'm scripting out right now are 100% conducive to a longer form video like the second soul possession video, so if you prefer the longer stuff, keep an eye out for those. This one was more of a side project. Fun fact, for those who've stuck it out, for the first two videos, only about 30% of people were still watching by the end of the video. So if you're one of those, you've got a better attention span than 70% of people, or a better tolerance for my style of content. I had a couple people asking about Discords, and I have no fucking clue how any of that works, so leave a comment if you do, I guess. Next up is my longest project by word count, and the video that I think is the best representation of a theory video that I've made so far, the connections theory.
Are you there? Are we connected? What is connection? A transfer of data from one vessel to another. A bridge between one place and another. Meeting a new person. Understanding, sharing, falling in love, a love that finds its way. Because, as we know, the bonds you break may make you stronger.
If you used the internet in the 90s or early 2000s, back in the days of AOL and Alta Vista when Amazon was a bookstore and social media was an IRC chat room, there's an unmistakable sound that in all likelihood you associate with that era of internet frontier. Dial-up internet access was the standard before broadband took over. Dial-up, so named because it directly utilized your home telephone line to secure a connection to the World Wide Web. You would connect your computer to a dial-up modem, which connected to your phone line to transmit essentially data in audio format, not unlike a much more complicated computer-readable Morse code. Older modems would acoustically transfer the data via the handset. Newer ones didn't need to, but still recreated the dial-up noise as it was being sent over the telephone lines with a little speaker for the user's convenience. Then, your internet provider would direct that traffic around the world, forming the network of computers called the internet. And during the whole process, you were basically making a phone call to your ISP, so you had to make the choice between browsing the web at 56 kilobits per second. That would take you 160 hours just to download this video you're watching right now, or calling your friend after school. That sound I played for you earlier is not the sound of that highly advanced Morse code. No, you'd only hear that if you were able to listen to the phone line while the dial-up connection was already active. That sound is the sound of two modems negotiating with each other, establishing the initial connection and deciding what communication formatting to use, and then testing the phone line to see what speed it can handle. They're deciding what the Morse code is going to sound like to each other, using other Morse code that was set up beforehand as specifically how these modems are going to greet and connect to each other. But to most people, especially those of us who were stupid kids when dial-up was still around, that sound was just the sound of the internet. And you can see plenty of breakdowns and clickbait articles calling it that, or the dial-up sound. The real sound of the internet would be nothing but garbage noise. But our dial-up handshake is what sounds suspiciously like. This is the sound of Kris's cell phone in the dark world. It's also the sound of the shelter, the door in the holiday basement, and of entry 17 from Undertale. For the two doors, it's been slowed down by the funny Gaster number, and in entry 17, the sound goes on for much longer. If we want to stretch it, it could also be the sound the Addison heard on Spamton's phone. And it sounds quite a lot like our dial-up handshake sound. But I don't think it's the sound of a handshake, I think it's the sound of a full-blown connection. I'm starting to lose track of time. Has it been days? Hours? If someone told me it's been years, I might believe them. It's just nothing but pitch black silence, except for the noise. The scratching noise I sometimes hear. This sounds crazy,
But even though no one can hear me, when I hear that noise, I feel like someone's listening. Anyone, if you're there, thank you. I like to play Dungeons & Dragons. Specifically, I like to DM. I've been doing it semi-weekly for nearly 9 years for the same group, so I like to think I'm at least halfway decent at it. And one thing I picked up on very early in my DMing, and have carried it through faithfully since, is a simple rule of 3. If I want to be sure my players pick up on a clue, I'd better put it in front of them 3 times because they'll definitely miss the first 2. Now, in those rare times when a player is on top of their game, picking up on all the subtleties, paying perfect attention, they might catch all 3. And it can be jarring, because it might feel like the DM is bashing something over your head if they repeat it that many times. I felt like that player when I went through Chapter 2 again. So maybe you were just staying up late talking to Asriel online again. Wait, you can't do that, right? I hope the internet gets fixed soon. I don't want to revert to my primal form. Recently, something called the internet is having an outage. Some say it was the secret to Queen's know-how. Since then, it seems like she's become quite extreme. Each day they spend hours worshipping and glowing rapture. Our screens of funny animals and candied games, staring, tapping to receive joy. Staring, tapping to avoid pain. Until recently, when the town's internet disappeared. Now the refuge they take in the screens will slowly fade. And those are the 3 I caught. I wasn't on top of my game. There are at least 2 more direct mentions of the internet being down in hometown. Why? Why was it so important that I, the player, understand that the internet is out? Important enough to dedicate time in the light world, in the dark world, and in the final boss's monologue emphasizing just how down the internet is. Would it have changed much if the internet weren't on? It's a fine enough reason to not let Kris contact Asriel via email, but nothing's stopping them from calling their brother, and we haven't had 5 boxes of dialogue explaining why the cell service is down, because it isn't. We can call Toriel just fine. So why do it? Why put so much emphasis on this idea? I think it's because Toby Fox is showcasing a rule for us. A rule of this world and the Dark Worlds that we haven't been told yet, but that exists to keep things consistent, and not emphasizing the internet being down would cause problems for Toby should the time come for the rule to be explained in full. I think the rule is this. Anything with an active two-way connection across the light world-dark world barrier keeps its function to maintain that connection. Doors, windows, Kris's cell phone, the soul. All objects that stay exactly as they are, in function if not in form, when going from the light world to the dark world. Active, as in currently ongoing, so not a disconnected laptop, and two-way, as in able to communicate back to the source, so not a television receiver. If the internet weren't out, then none of the computers in the lab would have changed drastically into the characters of the dark world we see them as. Nothing protects the connection itself though. The function remains the same, so a door can be closed, a phone can be powered off, a laptop disconnected, but once that happens, the nature of the object can shift, and it can be difficult or impossible to re-establish the connection. Let's take a step back so I can try to explain where my head's at. There's a point in space which is a hard cutoff between a light world and a dark world. Let's call that point the light world, dark world boundary. That boundary, so far, has always been placed in a doorway. That doorway serves as the point of connection between the light and dark worlds, allowing people and objects to cross the boundary from one world to another. And those doors always appear as these grand golden doors in the dark world, maintaining the original function of their reflection in the light world because it is actively connecting the two worlds together. A door couldn't become something else like a darkener unless that door were something like an interior door connecting two places within the same dark world. A door could become something else that still maintains the active connection and keeps its original function, something like a column of light that we see in Castletown. A window remains a window. Windows allow light and information to pass from one location to another, creating a visual connection that doesn't allow direct passage. You can see, from the dark sanctuaries in Chapter 4, that the windows of the church remain strikingly similar to their light world form. And from the light world, we can see the influence of the dark world on the church's interior from the outside. That connection between the two worlds holds fast. Considering all the sweet Darkner designs we got, don't you think a stained glass angel would have been an excellent fit as an enemy to encounter? Popping out of the background like the Wicca does, it seems like such a perfect chance for a cool Darkner design to not capitalize on it, unless there was some stronger reason not to, like a rule that can't be broken. Kris's cell phone, and the soul. These really are the most important objects on this list. I believe the sound we hear coming from the phone as we try to call is not some sort of interference masking the capabilities of the cell phone, as I think most would initially assume, but the sound of the data that is being sent to and from Kris's phone actively at all times during the Dark World. I think this is the sound of us, the player, actively controlling the soul via the connection established at the very beginning of Chapter 1 by the person who initiated the vessel's creation sequence, widely, but not universally, accepted to be W.D. Gaster, a hypothesis strengthened if the connection established by the vessel creator shares the same sound as the screen that gave us Entry 17, the original wingding scribing that we had to grasp our little theorizing paws on. Now, unfortunately, objects with an active two-way connection aren't the only objects that remain the same between the light and the dark world. Objects inextricably tied to shadow and darkness, like the shadow crystals and the black shard, remain the same or pretty similar to their dark world incarnations in the light world. But so do some objects that should be mundane. Noelle's watch and the odd controller, for instance. These might be objects with some other kind of connection, but that's too much speculation even for me.
The soul has long been called many things, the font of our compassion, the source of our will, the container of our life force. But even now, the true function of it is unknown.
I'm sure some questions are already forming in your heads. If that is the sound of the player's connection to the soul, why do we only hear it in the dark world? And why does it come from the phone at all, and not just directly from the soul? Why do we hear the same coming from the shelter slowed down? I know you're asking those questions because those are the questions that have been haunting me and that I've been desperately trying to seek the answers to. Thankfully, I do think one of these questions helps to answer the other. Why do we only hear the garbage noise coming from Kris's phone in the dark world? And why do we hear it from the shelter? I think these seemingly conflicting observations can be chalked up to the observer effect. The idea that by measuring or observing something, you inherently change the thing you're trying to observe. Like if you wanted to test how sticky a piece of tape was, you could stick it to your finger and pull it off, but in doing so, that tape would get a little less sticky, because some of that glue is now on your finger. When we cross the light world dark world boundary and enter a dark world, I believe the nature of the signal coming from the shelter changes. From our perspective, what is the main difference between the light and the dark world? In the dark world, we can fight, act, spare, equip armor and weapons, see our party members' stats, change our options, and most of all, save. One tester said, players will find it very inconvenient that you cannot save or load in the light world. I was initially resistant, but I decided to add save points there in Chapter 4. In Chapter 4, when we save in the light world, it's implied that it's odd that a save point is here at all. It's faint, it doesn't belong. I believe that's because it's a function of Kris's and the soul's active connection to the shelter, a connection running at a much slower speed when Kris is in the light world, a connection that can just barely manifest strongly enough to create the faintest save point, where it shouldn't be able to handle even that at all. Just a bare-bones, incomplete menu for the soul to navigate. Then, when Kris crosses the boundary to the dark world, the connection kicks into high gear, transmitting more data, faster, facilitating the full-featured menu and save system for the soul. If we take the battle menus to be diegetic not fully for the characters, Kris, Ralsei, and Susie, but diegetic for the soul, then it would make sense why a stronger, active, high-speed connection would be needed where it wouldn't be in the light world. A connection that uses Kris's phone's full capabilities, preventing its normal functions as a phone only while inside the dark world. In the light world, that connection barely uses any of the phone's strength, so calls are still fully accessible. Side note, this could also be an explanation for why Kris has never pulled the soul from their body in the dark world. It could be that it's only possible to sever that connection while it's weak in the light world. I believe that were we able to be in the dark world and require that stronger connection, while being able to listen to the door of the shelter in the light world, we would hear the garbage noise being played at full speed. But our observer effect manifests because we can only listen to the shelter door while we're in the light world, while the connection is weakest, and while the sound is playing at its slowest, muted speed. And Kris, even though they kept looking at me, like they wanted to say something, everything that came out of their mouth sounded odd, like it was on speaker or something. Sounds like normal Kris to me. Well, it wasn't. Something was weird. The most fascinating, frustrating, enticing, maddeningly obtuse thing about the Soul and Kris's connection is the impact it has on Kris's voice. Kris's voice has 3 described states by Susie: mumbling, shouting, and really good at flirting. That last one sounds like I'm joking, but Susie really does feel like she's building up to say something else there. I think Kris is just weird, period. Yeah, sometimes they mumble, sometimes they yell, but sometimes it's like, dude, I don't know why, but like, for some reason they're really, really good at flirting. Instead of saying whatever she was going to say, she decides to cover it up with a flirting comment. Susie is struggling through this whole conversation to poorly keep the secret that the Dark Worlds are real, so she can't give a more serious description of what Kris's voice sounds like if what she really wants to say is when Kris is giving commands during battle. When does Kris ever flirt with enemies? It's only ever during battles. When Kris points their finger and hearts come out, Kris completely breaks all previous characterizations of themselves by apparently becoming a flirt master. And before you rush to defend Kris because being a quiet nerd doesn't inherently make you bad at flirting, Noelle, who self-describes as knowing Kris better than anyone, is flabbergasted by the idea of Kris flirting, so either they're acting out of character here, or they developed incredible social skills on their own with no help, as a true gamer does, because rumors of that would get around fast in a small town if Kris were flirting with anyone. During battles is the time when we, as the Soul, are at our most in control of the situation, when the Soul issues direct commands and the characters listen. Commands we can give even when Kris is down and cannot speak. Susie, Rouse, and most notably Noelle, can still follow them, but we can't give them when Kris isn't there. Just the Soul's proximity isn't enough, or else Susie would have been able to hear us when fighting Lancer, or walking through the jail, or on the Ferris wheel. We can see the Soul zip over from Kris's body, but that isn't enough for her to hear us. We know Susie knows Kris is giving the commands in battle. It's what she agreed to all the way back in Chapter 1, and she asked for the same help in her fight against Gerson. During the Gerson fight, you can see the Soul zipping back and forth from where Kris is standing over there by Rouse, so Kris is easily close enough for Susie to hear. When I went through this battle, I fully expected at some point for the Soul's origin point to change. This seemed like the perfect opportunity for Kris and Rouse to sneak off and have one of their private chats that they always have. Maybe with Rouse cluing in Kris to the fact that Susie should be stopped from reading the final prophecy, but that never happens. I think Kris and Rouse would have absolutely taken that opportunity if they could, but if they were to have strayed too far, Susie wouldn't have been able to hear the Soul's commands anymore. If there were some purely psychic link between the Soul and Noelle, or the Soul and Susie, I don't think things would have lined up like this. I think Susie would have heard our choices. I think Noelle would have freaked out one choice earlier. I think there's a physical, audible component of the Soul's voice, separate from Kris's ability to vocalize speech, and that component has been stated directly by Noelle as the biggest piece of, hey reader, pay attention to this conversation, I'm explaining the future twist right in front of you, foreshadowing of all time. The Soul's voice, in part, comes from Kris's phone speaker. I hate doing this. I've tried to write and rewrite this section so many times, and every time it's more evidence, more complications, but none of it successfully sways me from my chosen path, so for a bit, let me bring back the speculation meter from last video, let it run on the next few minutes of my script ahead of time, and... yeah, that about tracks. I'm going to pose a theory I believe in, and then I'm going to spend the whole next session of the video tearing it apart with examples that don't work. And I want your help in killing this idea, because with all these examples, my brain is still firmly telling me that it's true anyways, and I'd rather accept reality than continue deluding myself, so. I believe the reason Kris's voice sounds like it's coming from a speaker is because when the Soul is influencing Kris, it is doing so via their phone speaker. Because the phone is the primary point of connection between the player, the shelter, and the vessel creator, who is Gaster, and Kris. Like an acoustic dial-up modem, the phone is somehow transmitting words and commands that Kris's body interprets and executes with some level of autonomy over their execution, and as part of that process the phone outputs certain words and feelings audibly that can be heard that Kris is passing off as part of their own voice. When a dialogue choice poses two options, one that Kris agrees with and one that Kris does not, Kris will attempt to smother the sound and change the interpretation if they do not agree, and they will lend their own voice, words, and emphasis to the option they do agree with. Is the phone literally outputting the words Kris is supposedly saying? No, probably, maybe, except sometimes, yeah, I think so. Because there are times when characters can hear Kris, when Kris cannot be able to vocalize what we want them to say. And there are also times where the soul's options don't give any room for Kris to change the interpretation to an outcome they would clearly prefer, like an outcome that doesn't involve actively torturing their childhood friend. Let's dismantle this nonsense. Exhibit 1. Susie. How the f*** wouldn't Susie realize what's happening? Kris is a quiet-ass kid. They're not speaking to anyone, ever. So everyone else gets a pass because the opportunities to realize something's up are so slim that they can be forgiven for thinking Kris is just hitting human puberty, and no one here knows how that works. But Susie spent 4 days with the kid, and Kris has been very talkative throughout that, by their standards at least. Only Rousey's heard as much from them, but Rousey's overlooking a hell of a lot more when it comes to soul nonsense than just some voice stuff, so Rousey not saying anything makes sense too. But Susie has to have heard sounds coming from Kris's phone if this has been a thing. She can't have been that inattentive. Hey Kris, do you hear something? Sounds like it's coming from your pocket? Your phone going off or something? Hey Kris, does your phone usually, yell? Hey Kris, pick up your damn phone. Yeah, no. If there's been noise coming from Kris's pocket, Susie would know. She knew from the other room where Lance's voice was coming from. She'd have to have heard the sound of Kris's connection. Susie's a bit thick. It took her 4 chapters to ask what was up with the red heart thing, but she can't be that thick. Exhibit 2. Did you say of course? You covered up your mouth yawning there. You're nodding. That means, yes, doesn't it? This is a moment, one of many moments, where Kris uses our exact chosen words as their response to a question. However, they stifle the words by covering their mouth and yawning. What, did they also reach down and cover the phone speaker with their hand at the same time? Why does that fit so nicely with every other time Kris has defied us or tried to defy us using their hand, creating thematic space for cutting off their hand, symbolizing the complete removal of their agency by not only severing the limb with which they rebel against us, but also that which smothers our voice and gives them the power to— Soda man, hey, Soda, hey, listen to me buddy, snap out of it. This is the counterexample section. Get it together, stay on target. Okay. Exhibit 3. What, I got something on my face or something? Huh? Why are you talking with your mouth closed? Nothing? Then why'd you wait so long to say it? I can't do it. This is the line that still haunts me, like that damn inspect text on the heart-shaped pillows in the holiday house. These lines too have dug their way deep into my brain, and now it's all I want to talk about. These lines, this whole exchange is weird. This exchange breaks so many of the established patterns of what we and Kris each have control over. Every other time we select something with our little red heart pointer, it's because there's something prompting us. Someone asks a question. There's a choice between multiple options. There's an action that needs to be either done or not done. And this text box is so close to lining up with one of those things. Susie asks a question. What, I got something on my face or something? But the choicer doesn't appear. Kris looked at Susie, prompting her response, prompting her to ask the question. But instead of this little box appearing, instead Kris and Susie look away, back to the lake, and we chill for another 20 whole seconds before the choice appears with no prompt, no question, nothing. And the choices are, say what's on your mind, or say nothing. Say nothing has Kris twist the interpretation around, the same way they do when they say, ask Susie how she's doing, implying Kris is rebelling against the choice a little. The soul wanted Kris not to say anything, so Kris said what they could in that moment to rebel against that choice. They said the word nothing. But with say what's on your mind, Kris doesn't take that same tactic. They talk with their mouth closed and presumably say the thought aloud that prompted the choice to appear. Kris had a thought and in that moment could not decide whether to say it or not, and the choice between saying it or not manifested in a choice for us, the player, to make. But Kris, in the time it takes for us to choose, thinks better of saying what they wanted to, and muffles it by keeping their mouth closed. But Susie still hears the words, the thoughts, and to me that could so easily be those thoughts are being output by the phone via the connection to the soul, but inaudible to Susie over the waves without Kris confidently acquiescing with a choice and lending it their own voice.
The day he was to be evicted from Queen's Mansion, I went to his room to check on him, but he wasn't there. There was only a phone hanging off the handle. He must have left in the middle of a conversation, because I could still hear someone on the other end. But when I put the receiver to my ear, there was nothing but garbage noise.
There's an exceptional amount of weight put on telephone calls in Deltarune. In Chapter 2, Spamton's success was driven by a phone call, and in Chapter 3 we learned that success ignited Tenna's jealousy, and the strain of both is what destroyed what was a happy partnership, and sent both on dark paths associated with a mysterious figure whose call ends with the garbage noise. But in Chapter 4, we get the most impactful calls of all, the phone calls that reveal to us that Kris formed a connection without us. A connection to the ones who would sacrifice Undyne, create a dark fountain in the church, and use Kris's soul to accomplish some plan. If you're like many of us, having to wait many years between the chapters, consuming what we had multiple times over, piecing through everything, then Kris being a separate character from the soul won't have come as any surprise. But even if that's the case, Chapter 4's Home Alone sequence, as it's labeled in the code, is such a shocking breach of the connection between the player and Kris that it's beyond fitting that the track that plays is called The Distance Between Two, a slowed down and muted version of Lost Girl, signifying the weakening connection between the player and Kris. As not only the physical and emotional distance between the two grows larger, Lost Girl 2 grows weaker, becomes more distant, slowing down, muffling the instrumentation, because we can only listen to the shelter door while we're in the light world, while the connection is weakest, and while the sound is playing at its slowest, muted speed. And so the phone call is a connection between Kris and the antagonists, straining our connection to Kris as we witness a connection forming and strengthening between Noelle and Susie. But the chapter ends with a phone call as well. 2 different phone calls, depending on whether or not you're playing through the weird route. The first time any of the chapters in Deltarune have had a substantial difference in their endings. But why is that? Let's assume Carol is the caller in both instances. I'm well aware this is a contentious topic from my last video, primarily because of this change of ending, but I'm going to do my best to give a satisfying reason for why I still believe it to be Carol, in spite of the many arguments against her. What is the difference between the normal route and the weird route that causes the phone call to sound different? To answer a question with another, what, from Carol's perspective, has primarily changed between the 2 routes? Something that has to do with Carol's call in both routes. In the normal route, Susie shouts to Carol that she's taking Noelle to the festival tomorrow. In the weird route, she never gets the chance. Side note for the weird route, while we don't see Kris make any calls to Carol, we also don't see them access their phone at all, but the contacts are still wiped clean, so Kris did do something with their phone outside of the player's view, which could have entailed making the same call, prompting her returning home. Back to the main point, Carol has been preparing for the festival non-stop, presumably for a long time. It's been her primary responsibility as mayor. It would make sense if she has some specific role for her daughter to play in it, and we've seen that in the past, Noelle and Kris have been forced into certain interactions, like riding the Ferris wheel at the festival before. Maybe this is the crux of Carol's threatening promise to Kris. Kris having promised to escort Noelle to the festival, or ensure her being present for some specific part to play in the festival, maybe having to do with Carol's Dark World plans. This would make sense as to why she's calling in both routes. In the normal route, to remind Kris of their promise because Susie taking Noelle is potential for it not being fulfilled. And in the weird route, to calmly confirm that things are going to plan. But that explains the different content of the call, not the sound of the call, right? One is crisp and clear, audibly confirmable as Carol, whereas the other is crackly, muffled, partially inaudible speaker voice. Not unlike Kris's voice. My proposal is that not only is it not unlike Kris's voice, I think it is exactly what Kris's voice sounds like. Imagine if your closest friend, someone you've known all your life, suddenly started making this sound as they spoke. You'd be rightfully weirded out, as Noelle has been every time she's interacted with Kris. I think these two voices are the same, because they're using the same connection mechanism, the same data transfer protocol over this strange acoustic dial-up connection, as the soul's connection does. I think this is what it sounds like when a voice has to be transferred across the light world dark world boundary. A step further, I think the soul's voice is coming from across a boundary on the other side of both worlds, outside the realms of light and dark. And if that idea is foreign to you, please check out Molly Stars' Device Theory series of videos. It's a phenomenally detailed breakdown of this idea as it pertains to the first 2 chapters, and going into more detail is out of the scope of this video and would be wildly inferior to Molly Stars' work anyways, so just go watch that instead. But in short, that's why I believe Kris's voice has that alien speaker-like quality in both the light and dark worlds, because this connection is essentially linking to the device layer where the origin of the soul's connection is. Phew, okay. Getting back to the point, Carol's calls should sound the same in both the weird route and the normal route, right? But not if Noelle's presence at the festival is important enough in a specific way that Carol will need to take extra precautions in the sheltered dark world in case Kris's promise falls through. If the normal route call comes from across a light world dark world boundary and the weird one doesn't, because in the weird route Kris is keeping their promise and Carol isn't worried about any extra precautions, then the sound being so different makes sense.
From now on, defeating enemies with violence will make them lost. Lost enemies cannot become recruits ever again. But the bonds you break may make you stronger.
Despite the distance between the two of us widening during the Home Alone sequence, the bond between the player and Kris has gotten much stronger as the chapters have gone on. That might seem counterintuitive. Shouldn't Kris's ability to act independently of us be a sign that our connection with them is weakening? Just look at the difference in how Kris asserts their preferences for which response fits their mood. Lost sleep from being Susie's partner, you say with no negative intonation at all. Versus, your friendships are real. The stupid, fake, heroic way you said that, pretty good. The frequency and degree of severity of these sorts of moments, where Kris asserts their own feelings over the answer you as the soul give, increases exponentially after the start of Chapter 3. In Chapters 3 and 4, Kris is howling all over the place, being a chaos gremlin, and putting their rebel energy into the response choices. It really feels like more and more of Kris as a person is shining through, while the soul's influence wanes. What once was the most poignant moment of Kris's independence was one-upped by the moment where, by far, Kris appeared the most emotional, afraid, and human in any chapter so far. We even had a moment of true connection between the soul and Kris, where for just a moment there was enough trust between the two of them for Kris to take a moment in their own body, in the dark world, to play a piece for Susie and Rouse. So why do I say the bond is strengthening between the two of us? Because in the world of Deltarune, personal strength, the power for you to overpower someone else's will, assert control, issue commands, subjugate them, utterly and completely, comes from breaking bonds, not forming them. As our bonds grow stronger, to Kris, to the characters, our ability to assert our will over Kris wanes, because it becomes harder to see Kris as a nameless puppet protagonist. That bond is what makes us see Kris as their own person, to recognize their humanity, and wish for more moments where they choose and act without us. We start to pick the options Kris would want, even if they're out of character for us as the players. We understand the pain that having your body taken away must inflict, and so we relish in those sparse moments where Kris is truly independent from us, which is what makes the weird route so gut-wrenchingly awful to play through, to watch, to experience those bonds shatter. Systematically, we force Noelle to become stronger, freezing enemies not only to sever the bonds between them and us, but between Noelle and Kris. Their prior friendship is twisted beyond comprehension, shattered and beaten, sacrificed at the altar of becoming more powerful, of being able to enforce your will on another. The soul's control over Kris is never stronger than these moments, where no amount of word twisting, intonation meddling, altering of the delivery can override the soul's simple command to proceed. Kris tries to rebel against it, in their moments alone from the soul, to repair that fractured bond, but it's not enough, and Kris ends up dealing the final blow to their and the soul's bond themselves, in a fit of deserved rage. And we see the strength Kris has gained by distancing themselves from the soul, by breaking that bond, in fully manifesting their will in this final choice box, blocking us fully from making any decision, deafening us to what they say, and fully asserting their own will over the broken connection between us.
See that heart, Kris? That's a soul, the culmination of a human's being. Not only does it represent one's will and compassion, but it also has the power to determine fate.
Compassion. Empathy, care for others. Will, volition, the strength to change the world. Rousey takes the first to heart. Rousey believes, all the way until seeing Suzy smash the final prophecy pane, that compassion has the power to determine fate. This world is full of all kinds of people, Kris. In the end, how we treat them makes a difference, so let's try our best to get by without fighting. If we can manage that, I believe this tale may have a happy ending. Otherwise, I fear that you may not find the result favorable. I thought if I said something different, if we did something different, if we were just kind enough, perhaps by the time we got here, it would change. And in the course of our adventure, despite Rousey's belief faltering at the end of Chapter 4, compassion has had a sizable impact on the result. Maybe the pains of the prophecy haven't changed, but the difference between a castle town with and without love is stark. After all, there's something more important than reaching the end. But if changing the ending is the only thing that matters, then the strength to enforce your will upon the narrative is needed. Rousey wonders, if there was something else, what would it be? And how do we know it wouldn't be something even worse if exercising one's will is taken to the far extremes? But to a soul doing everything in its power to change fate, it matters not what the end is, so long as it had a hand in its creation. In this way, will and compassion are two diametrically opposed forces, at odds with each other, warring for control over the narrative of Deltarune, manifesting in the split between the normal and the weird route, and in Chapter 3, perhaps even the sword route emerging as another source of will, with Kris acquiring a weapon with which to shape their own fate by enacting the equivalent of the Undertale Jedicide route. The soul can represent both of these forces, and I believe the opposition between the two of them is a zero-sum game. The more the soul enforces its will over the characters of the narrative, the less compassion it can muster. And likewise, the more the soul's compassion for the characters grow, the less its controlling will can dictate the actions of the characters. Because being compassionate means letting go and wanting the characters to have the freedom to live happily and safely. This, I think, is the true meaning of the bonds you break may make you stronger. The soul has the choice to play the zero-sum game, to sacrifice compassion for the sake of their font of will, for the strength to better dictate the course of the narrative. In a normal, violent route, you sacrifice a castle town where love is strong and your friends are there to greet you, for the strength to overcome the powerful enemies standing in your way with fewer hurdles, fewer obstacles. In the weird route, you sacrifice fully the agency of Kris and Noelle, you sever any compassionate feelings you have for either of them, blatantly ignoring every one of the dozens of opportunities to apologize, reconcile, deflect, or even apathetically discontinue the route, in favor of the force of will to warp the narrative around your choices and finally see a new continuity for yourself. You held the crystal up to your eye. For some strange reason, the prophecy's text does not work in the crystal's lens. You shook the crystal. However, nothing changed. Holy circuits, that was a long and winding path to end up here. You'd be forgiven if you've forgotten where this all started, so, as is tradition, let me wrap up this video with a night challenge fight going in the background to keep that attention span engaged. This time, we'll do Kris only. This all started with what I feel is a fairly strong connection. For someone around my age, which Toby Fox is, I think the knee-jerk connection to be made with a sound like the garbage noise coming from Kris's phone is to the dial-up handshake connection sound. It's a feeling connected with the nostalgia of the era that Deltarune clearly repeatedly tries to invoke, despite the fact that Among Us is canon and that phone apps are a thing. Even though the dial-up sound is the handshake between two modems that establishes a connection, and not the sound of the actual internet traffic and data being transmitted, I think there's enough zeitgeisty feeling behind the sound representing the early internet itself that the garbage noise being the sound of an active connection overriding the phone's usual functions isn't too much of a stretch. From there, we look at why an active connection across the light world-dark world boundary matters, how it anchors objects into something alike to their original forms, keeping their original functions in order to maintain any existing two-way connections, whether those connections be rooted in physical or technological space, and that is why Chapter 2 goes out of its way to repeatedly explain that Hometown's internet is out, likely making the internet outage part of the overall conspiracy brewing involving the Knight, Carol, Kris, and due to the ties to the garbage noise and being the establisher of the connection it produces, likely W.D. Gaster. Then, we look at what the connection means for Kris, the Soul, and the Fun Gang in general. Why does Kris's phone only make the garbage noise in the dark world? Because when Kris and Susie enter the dark world, the connection between the shelter, Kris's phone, and the Soul strengthens significantly, allowing the Soul to save, give commands in battle, and access the complete Dark World menu for every party member. And all of this extra data overrides the normal function of the phone, which is why once the connection is weakened in the light world, the normal functions of the phone return, and it can be used to make phone calls. Kris's voice is up next, and that to me is the part that is the most interesting and the most frustrating, because it's the conclusion that I'm the least confident in, but the most invested in, which is a bad place to be if your focus is on giving good information. I think Kris's voice is, in some way, augmented by the physical speakers on their phone, through the output of some combination of data through the Soul connection which allows us to control Kris, make choices, take actions, and assert our will over them. Sometimes, that involves characters in the story being able to hear the words output by the speakers, but other times it results in that output data augmenting and modifying Kris's voice, resulting in the speaker-like quality that Noelle finds so unnerving and strange as Kris's close childhood friend. Kris can then assert their own preferences and feelings onto our choices by either lending their own delivery to the choices or attempting to stifle and mute it, thereby resulting in the myriad ways Kris could handle our choices throughout the chapters. Following up on why Kris's voice sounds different is why I believe a voice of a possible multiple voices on the phone to be Carol, and why her voice has that same speaker-like quality described by Noelle. I think the phenomenon causing both instances is the same. Both are the result of a voice being transmitted via the connection orchestrated by W.D. Gaster across the light world-dark world boundary, or in the case of the Soul's voice, across a boundary between the device layer, where W.D. Gaster established our connection initially, and the light and dark worlds. That then explains why Carol's phone call sounds different in each ending. In the normal ending, she's calling from within a dark world, and in the Weird Root ending, she's in the light world. The reason why her location would change would then be because of Kris's promise. In the normal route, Carol is worried that Kris won't keep their promise, and so is taking extra precautions in a dark world as a contingency for if her plan A doesn't work. In the Weird Route, she doesn't have the same worry. That could be because in the normal route, Susie declares she's taking Noelle to the festival, whereas in the Weird Route, Noelle tells Carol she's looking forward to seeing Kris there, pointing to Kris's promise having something to do with Noelle and the festival. And so we end on what I believe to be the biggest takeaway from this long and winding road. And that is the idea of the Soul playing a zero-sum game, having to choose to balance will and compassion, and leaning towards either side necessarily meaning the sacrifice of the other. In the normal route, we build up connections with others, and begin to feel more compassionate for each of the characters, which weakens our strength of will over them, leading to more moments where Kris is independent outside of the control of our force of will as the chapters go on. Likewise, the Weird Root sacrifices and breaks bonds between the Soul and the characters, and between the characters and each other, taking the strength of will to shape the direction of the narrative and the choices of the characters by willfully disregarding their feelings, happiness, and free will, by leaving compassion behind, which is ultimately the meaning behind the bonds you break may make you stronger. So we've reached the end of another one. I imagine if you've watched my other videos before this one, you might have thought at some point, hey, wait a minute, doesn't this directly conflict with X, Y, and Z in the second soul possession and using math to solve Deltarune videos? Well, dear viewer, yes it does. But dedicating more of this video to reconcile conflicts between other theories I proposed would be daunting, and would make the prior videos somewhat of a required viewing for this one. I think putting together some sort of mega theory that combines all of my videos together in some way that makes sense would make for a good finale video before Chapter 5 comes out next year. Until then, each video will have to be in a sort of silo unless I have some reason to make a specific follow-up to any of them. And to help kill time until then, I've set up a Discord server, so come hang out. I'll be in there taking any questions about the video and reading any theories y'all cook up. Looking forward to seeing you. I have some ideas for some community segments for future videos, so you can get in on the ground floor for those. I don't really like doing the YouTuber thing of asking for likes and subscribes and whatever during the bulk of the video. I feel like it breaks the flow of things and makes the videos worse, so I'll do it now. Reading your comments is the best part of the videos though, so share your thoughts here on YouTube or in the new Discord. See you there.
Hi there. Haven't done one of these before, but enough stuff piled up after the release of the Connections video that I wanted to do a follow-up. Some stuff people pointed out, some stuff I missed, and some stuff that really got me thinking and includes a lot of new insight. Then, once I went through all that, I asked the Sodaman Discord server if there's anything else I should include, so thank you to them for the help in making sure this follow-up is as complete as possible, and if you'd like to participate in future videos like that, make sure you join. Let's start with some Spamton stuff. In the original Connections video, I alluded to Spamton's situation. I mentioned the garbage noise in connection to Spamton's calls, described by the Addisons and by Tenna. I don't think I gave the similarities between Spamton and Kris's situation quite enough time and explanation, and I think the YouTube user CharDreamer9337 points it out quite well. From this, I think we could say that Spamton was being puppeteered through his phone in a similar way as Kris, since he was emitting garbage noise, although I don't know yet how this recontextualizes his story. Kris and Spamton both represent a subject under complete control by an outside force. Spamton's strings are literal wires puppeting his movements, while Kris's are metaphorical, Kris being both under control of the player but also Carol, as according to the ideas put forth in the Connections and in the Using Math to Solve Deltarune videos, Kris's promise is being used as a compulsive force by Carol to control Kris. Both of these centers of control are represented by phone calls. Spamton and Kris's phones produce the garbage noise, a signifier of the direct control the connection from the shelter has on both of them, and Kris's calls with Carol representing the metaphorical controlling connection she has over Kris. As for recontextualizing Spamton's story, reading CharDreamer's comment got me thinking about Hyperlink Blocked, and how if there truly was a connection from the shelter controlling Spamton, that the words Hyperlink Blocked as a source for his freedom could be read quite literally. Hyperlink Blocked is the power to block the link between him and the shelter, which would become the source of freedom for both Spamton and Kris. As for why the soul would then be the source of said Hyperlink Block, I think you could look towards the idea of the demon and angel souls that I brought up in the Using Math video as a potential answer. And, as a fun addition, I thought this line from Spamton's fight was particularly apt. Then we'll be the ones making the calls, Kris. They'll hear the ring of heaven's call. So, I had that in mind during the whole video. How can one make a theory about the angel talking through the phone while missing the line about the angel being tied to the phones? Because I'm a big dumb idiot, that's why. By far my biggest miss in this video was completely missing this connection to the connection theory. Definitely a moment of focusing on the tiny details and missing the big picture, literally, right in front of my face. I tunneled onto the voice aspect and neglected probably the biggest piece of evidence that the phone is pivotal to the soul's control over Kris, or in the case of Player Angel, Heavens, the realm we as the player occupy, which exists across the boundary of the light and dark worlds, control over Kris. But this prophecy panel isn't the only one I think we can draw on here. This prophecy panel is one of a pair, linked physically by their location, digitally by their file names, and thematically by their subject matter. They'll see the tale of hell take crawl. If the first is referencing the phone call linking the player in heaven to the soul, then what could this opposing panel, referencing hell and a tail taking crawl, be referring to? It's the opposite in every way. Heaven versus hell, hearing versus sight, taking flight by the winged art versus taking crawl. Well, consider the unscrambled verse by the organic. Lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail. And by the organic stirring battle, the tale which must not be followed. I think this panel represents the opposite of the first, an antagonistic force exerting its control over others, leading and coaxing unsuspecting people deeper under its control. We, the player, have never been in control of Spamton, so to whom is Spamton connected to and controlled by?
He was lured into the clutches of the puppet strings by promises of success, promises that he'd be a big shot, and I think there's a good chance that it was by this tale of hell. There's a character I haven't referenced a single time throughout my videos, because I think there's both enough there for an entire video, while simultaneously nothing there at all, and that is image_friend. Linked to the same connection by its all-caps naming scheme in the code, following the same naming scheme of the elements of the device layer. I think friend is a candidate for another being exerting its control over the connection, with it being no coincidence that their first appearance was in the basement of Queen's mansion, where the empty disk is found and where we fight Spamton. Let's talk about Kris's voice. I asked for your help in killing my pet theory, and y'all provided. The strongest, I think, is during the weird route. Hey Kris. What happened? You started saying something, then you bit the hell out of your hand. Damn, that's gonna bruise. YouTube user Deltarune was, I believe, the first to point this out. I don't think Kris would need to bite the hell out of their hand, something they only do on the weird route. They pull the yawn trick again if you decide to be needlessly cruel dramatic on the normal route. If the sound was ultimately originating from their phone, that simply wouldn't be necessary, and is only something they do when pushed much further than usual. Biting the hell out of their hand, to me, makes the most sense if they're trying to smother words issuing from either their hand, unlikely, or their mouth, the normal place humans issue most of their communication noises from. I do agree that I think biting makes the most sense if Kris's voice is coming exclusively from their mouth, like you'd expect. I don't think it's a 100% slam dunk, as a small, unexpected happening has been enough of a jolt to interrupt the soul's choices in the past, like Susie interrupting or shouting, or Mini Kris stabbing at Susie, so it could be that the bite was just intended to inflict enough pain over the shared connection to stifle the soul's choice, instead of their usual methods of rebellion, because that choice was so offensive to Kris. But at that point, it does feel like digging deeper, so I think the side of sanity, and the comments, says the phone might be the conduit of the connection, but Kris's voice is still entirely coming from their mouth. My insanity is sticking with the phone speaker though. Moving on to the Discord discussion, a very Christmassy WD Gaster brought up a couple questions that are interesting. Do you think we will get concrete answers on how we, the soul, are connected with Kris? I hope so. If we get any answers about the exact mechanics going on with the soul, the player's connection, and the nature of the Dark Worlds, it'll probably be in a sequence similar to the True Lab section of Undertale, and I'd be surprised if it came sooner than near the climax of the story. Also, don't you think Kris could save on their own without the soul connection, given the save file in Chapter 1? Kris's save file is super interesting. This, combined with the flavor texts indicating Kris reached out to it out of habit, and others that make it seem like Kris is familiar with the save points, does indicate that Kris has used them in the past. When exactly is the question, and Kris's save file has neither time nor location associated. The timer in our save file begins the moment we launch Chapter 1, the moment we the player begin the program which eventually connects us to the soul. If Kris at some point saved when that timer is at 0, then they were present at the exact moment the device was turned on. This could have been some time in the past when Kris originally went to the shelter, if the connection is indeed routed through the shelter, initially connecting Kris's soul to that network before the player is ever involved. By the time we the players make a save, Kris's will has already been overwritten. Us saving over their file is just revealing the current state of things to the player via the UI. There's a lot more to get into regarding the save file that I think I'll save for a future video. Cappy on Discord shared some very interesting thoughts regarding the device theory and the nature of the garbage noise, but what I want to focus on is the note here. I believe the proceed thing doesn't actually have Kris talk. As if you choose please don't, Noelle feels like she shouldn't, even if Kris doesn't say something. I'm not sure how Kris makes Noelle feel like that, but it happened. I believe if it was Kris talking, the voice would have already scared Noelle. I brought up Noelle not freaking out about the first proceed briefly in the original video, but I think this is a good point to bring up in full. There's something odd about this choice regardless of whether or not you believe the correctly menacing voice that scares Noelle comes from the phone or not. Noelle clearly is afraid of the sound of that voice, demonstrated by her reaction and saying, "Kris, your voice, it..." And in her head, "That voice, how? The voice from my dream." So we can safely assume that in this choice, Noelle doesn't hear that voice. However, her reaction does change based on your choice here. I mean, I know you didn't say anything, but I guess let's just leave it at, "I'm glad you're back." Versus her continuing on with the conversation. The only real explanations for me are either Kris's body language changes in a way that we can't see based on our answer, or that the soul has some sort of faint mental link between itself and Noelle, maybe having manifested by the soul's actions during the weird route. It has to be something more faint than the usual commands, otherwise Noelle would have interpreted this proceed as being the same as the others, so the other proceeds can't have been entirely mental. There is some difference between a command being given when we're inside versus outside Kris's body. That mental link would also go some way towards explaining our ability to read Noelle's and other characters' minds. If the soul just has some innate ability to react to and influence people's minds in tiny ways, and these small influences are why Noelle is nudged towards either continuing or stopping her line of conversation over the events of the previous night. Again, I think this just has to be true regardless of any phone stuff, because even if Kris is always just speaking our commands aloud, they aren't doing so here, and Noelle is still being influenced, so it's a little messy no matter what. And that's that. I think I've covered everything that's been on my mind since the video's release. If there's anything else I missed, or any questions you've had, feel free to leave a comment or join the Discord and ask me. I'll do my best to answer. I don't see myself doing videos like this every time, but the Connections video was such a big project that I wanted to be thorough and make this little companion to it. Thanks for watching.
Following Connections is a deep dive into Deltarune's game over mechanics and how they relate to Image Friend.
When was the last time you got a game over in Deltarune? What about the first time? Do you remember what happened? I think the answers to these questions can provide for us a theory into the capabilities of one of the most enigmatic and ominous characters in the story so far, whose screen time can be measured in seconds rather than the hours we've spent with the others, and that character's Image_Friend. I'm going to dive deeply into the mechanics of Deltarune's game over, how it works, where we spawn, how the world changes, and why that all links back to the Cheshire Cat of the Dark Worlds, being a creature of determination, who I think might have the full power over the timelines of Deltarune. But first, let's turn back the clock a bit. A little more. Let's go all the way back 10 years to the release of Undertale, because we need to talk about determination. Not the determination of Deltarune, the force with which Lightners can create dark fountains and construct the narratives of the Dark World. No, let's talk about determination. The power, spoilers for Undertale obviously for the rest of the video, which Frisk wields in Undertale to redo events, make different choices, and resurrect from the dead. The power which Flowey uses to trap us in their world, to save and load over our reality in an attempt to force Frisk and the player to relive their days in the underground over and over again. Determination has always been something a little nebulous in Undertale. The save points tell us that we're filled with it, and we use it to make saves that we can then return to at any time we please. But it's also some sort of injectable matter or energy, extracted from human souls, that can warp living monsters into amalgamates, and in some form resurrect Asriel as Flowey the Flower. Saving and loading might as well be referred to as time travel in the world of Undertale, and we can see its full power as such in the Omega Flowey fight. Omega Flowey constantly saves and loads save files, rewinding our location to a previous point to disorient and disrupt the player throughout the fight, and attempt to fully undo a timeline where Omega Flowey lost. This is also the only time before Deltarune's release that we saw multiple save files being used, with File 2 being used during the fight, File 3 being used afterwards, and 6 being used to repeatedly reset the soul. This is primarily the form of determination that the title of the video is referencing. This ability to manipulate the timelines in Undertale seems to be an ability of whoever possesses the most determination at any given time. It can't be said for certain one way or another whether determination is still the power which governs the save files in Deltarune, since the only reference to determination we have is from Queen with regards to the creation of the Dark Fountains, a power which Lightners possess, the power of will. But there is a power which governs the save files, a power which fills either Kris or the player and empowers them to manipulate the timelines in the same way Frisk once did. I think that there is evidence that, much like Flowey in Undertale, there are characters in Deltarune which possess this power other than Kris and the player. 2 characters, at least, who can utilize Undertale's definition of determination and bend the timelines to their will. One of these 2 characters is self-evident, the Vessel Creator. Doesn't matter if you believe that disembodied voice to be Gaster or not, they're determination candidate number 1. The second is Image_Friend. Now, instead of diving into these determination candidates right away, let's go through a quick rundown of the parts of Undertale that talk about determination in ways that we care about. The association to saving, loading, and by extension, reversing time. It's also clunky to keep referring to Undertale determination and Deltarune determination separately, and will get confusing when referring to Deltarune's saving and loading power, so for simplicity, Let's refer to the ability to manipulate time via saving and loading as Save DT, and Lightner's ability to create dark fountains in Deltarune as Dark DT. For now, we're leaving to the side whether or not Save DT is related to Dark DT in any way in Deltarune, but both are present in the world of Deltarune, with Save DT referring to the Deltarune's ambiguous power referenced by the Deltarune save points. Now, on to what we know about Save DT that we've learned from Undertale. 1. Save DT is a diegetic explanation for saving and loading mechanics. Do you think you were the only one with that power? The power to reshape the world, purely by your own determination. The ability to play God. The ability to save. 2. One user of Save DT can cause others to fail. I thought I was the only one with that power, but I can't save anymore. Apparently your desires for this world override mine. I thought I could frighten you, then steal your soul. I failed. And when I tried to load my save file, it didn't work. Your determination, somehow it's even greater than mine. 3. Multiple save files can coexist in the same continuity. You can see here file 2, 3, and 6 being saved and loaded. 4. Flowey, a creature with the power of save determination, seems to remember everything across resets, excluding a post-truth pacifist true reset, but other characters can only remember vague fragments akin to deja vu. Cinnamon or butterscotch? Wait, do not tell me. Is it cinnamon? Hee hee hee. I had a feeling. Now, we can't say for certain that all of the above is one-to-one true in Deltarune, but let's see what does correlate. 1. Save DT is referred to as an ambiguous power that allows one to save, load, and restore to full HP. Additionally, the save files have ties to a device layer by the Chapter 1 Save and Load menu, and the quotes and speaking style of the vessel creator. 2. We'll come back to number 2. 3. Multiple save files can coexist, but there's little to say that they exist in the same continuity like they do in the Omega Flowey fight. The individual save files seem to function closer to parallel timelines rather than different snapshots in time that Omega Flowey uses them as. The reason I say that is because of the subtle differences between the save files created in each slot. The drawer is mostly empty, except for a school cross-country shirt with a tear in it, a very old school ID with an embarrassing haircut, a coupon book. Every coupon is for half off a large pizza. All the coupons expired before the book's print date, which would indicate that the save files are more likely to represent separate, ever so slightly different timelines, rather than snapshots of the same timeline. 4. There is one confirmed character whose memory persists past the point of a reset, and that is the vessel creator when they assist you in the fight against the knight. There are other characters whose behavior differs across resets, and I'll start diving into those shortly. We can see from the above 3 points that Save DT seems to behave similarly across Deltarune and Undertale, but Deltarune's presentation of it is skewed in some ways, and investigating just how similar this diegetic saving is across the games is going to take some interrogation of Deltarune's game mechanics. So let's start looking at what exactly happens when you game over in Deltarune. First off, let's look at an expected case. The party runs out of HP, and the game over screen appears, with a quote from Susie or Ralsei if either are present in your party. Declining to continue results in the world being covered in darkness, and we're treated to the haunting Darkness Falls track, one of my favorites on the entire OST, and one that most people will never hear, because who wouldn't select continue on this screen most of the time? Once the track completes, the game either closes or returns to the chapter select screen, depending on your game version. When selecting continue, you return to the last save point you saved at, with the game returning to the state it was in when you saved, with all party members at full HP. No, I will not address that elephant. This is exactly what happens in Undertale as well, minus the ability to select not to continue. A quote plays, and you're resurrected at full HP at the nearest save point. Typical video game behavior. But in Undertale, sometimes dying has an impact on your interactions with other NPCs post-reset. You can quickly flip Metaton's switch, Sans remarks on how many times it looks like you've died, and you can tell Asgore how many times he's killed you. Does Deltarune have any behaviors similar to these? That's a question I set out to answer, so I made a spreadsheet, started dying in every single place I can think of, tallied the results, and learned some very interesting things about how Deltarune and Undertale function under the hood. For starters, I need to define a new term for you, and that term is temp save. A temp save is, as the name suggests, a temporary save file that is created not by the player interacting with a save point, but by the game itself. A temp save is all of the data a full player-created save does, complete with all the flags, items, room, game states, etc., but it differs from a full save in that it does not persist when the game is closed. A temp save is only loaded when the player gets a game over, and the temp save is more recent than the most recent full save. Here, let's look at this. In Chapter 2, when the party splits up and Kris is left alone, a temp save is created, so if Kris dies to one of the upcoming solo fights without saving at the cat sign, Kris will reset to the temp save and not have to redo the Birdly mini-boss fight. There are a lot of these temp save points, and from my testing and looking through the code, they most frequently appear at one of the following situations. Someone leaves or joins the party, a puzzle is solved, Kris enters the Dark World, or a difficult fight or sequence is about to happen. I showed you an example of the first situation. For puzzle solving, this situation most frequently comes up in Chapter 2, which is also true of the temp saves in general, as Chapter 2 has the most temp save calls in its codebase, followed closely by Chapter 4, with Chapters 1 and 3 having significantly fewer of them. Each of the mouse puzzles triggers a temp save on completion, as well as all of the box puzzles in Chapter 1, including the rules card quote-unquote puzzles. Every time Kris enters one of the Dark Worlds, a temp save is created, see here in the second Sanctuary. This holds true across all of the Sanctuaries, and the earlier Dark Worlds as well. For the difficult sequences, many of Chapter 4's temp saves take place during the various dangerous climbing sections, especially for each section of the Titan encounter, but by far the funniest use of the temp saves are the two of the very few temp saves in Chapter 3, which are right in front of the two water cooler fights. Dying to either of these will put you back right to before the fight. Looking at these four situations, it's fairly easy to deduce, from a game design perspective, some of the reasons why these temp save points are added. 1. To prevent sequencing issues. I think this is the primary reason why the game temp saves. Especially for the temp saves when Kris enters the Dark World, but also when someone leaves the party or when a puzzle is solved. It's easy to imagine a world where, during game testing, a game over would cause issues if certain parts of the game had to be reset fully, like putting Kris back into the Light World or resetting boxes to their original locations. 2. For player convenience. By the nature of Deltarune's story structure, a lot of temp save points before big bosses or after puzzle solves also come after long story sections. For instance, the temp save which I labeled Queen Feet in my spreadsheet, this temp save existing means that if you happen to walk up the stairs at Queen's Mansion without saving, and die to the fire portraits for instance, you don't have to go all the way through the personalized room, light puzzle, and darkness statue explanation cutscenes, which would be a huge slog. Likewise, you have one right before the first Spamton encounter, which saves the player from having to redo a substantial number of cutscenes where they otherwise wouldn't have had a save point to use. While we're on the topic of player convenience, let's talk about one of the changes that happens fairly frequently during a game over, and that is dialogue skipping. Chapter 2 again has two very good examples of this. The Birdly Coaster fight and the first Spamton encounter again. Watch what happens for both of these boss fights after I've intentionally game overed on each. Know that the Birdly Coaster fight doesn't utilize a temp save system, but it still flags the player as having seen the dialogue and therefore skips the pre-fight cutscene. In my opinion, this doesn't seem to be a diegetic change. By that I mean, when the game does this, I don't think Birdly or Spamton has recognized that they won the fight before and are skipping their interactions purposefully in the fiction of the game. I think these occurrences are purely for the player convenience. I say that because we can look back at Undertale for contrast. There's usually some diegetic lampshading happening, some gag or mentioning of how Kris appears that clues the other characters into the fact that a reset has happened. In Deltarune, it just skips past all of that, and for player convenience shortcuts us to the fight that we found challenging enough to game over to it, with no further changes. That is, most of the time. In a few select instances, Deltarune does give us some diegetic flavoring to go with a reset, and those are why it's been so important to thoroughly establish this base case. Let's start with a couple fun ones that are strictly not resets. There's no save DT manipulation going on here. Versus Susie and Lancer. In Chapter 1, when fighting the Dark Fun Gang, Susie makes a bet with Kris and Rouse. If they win, Susie and Rouse will join the heroes. If they lose, they'll do whatever Susie says. So what happens when you lose this fight? Lancer laughs, and when you reappear at the spawn point, there's some unique dialogue for a couple more defeats in a row. Of note here is that if you don't save, your HP isn't filled back up either. So there's definitely no saving or loading going on here. Kris and Rouse just get their collective asses thrashed and then retreat from the room. Tennis boards. In Chapter 3, losing a fight while on one of Tennis boards results in Tennis stopping the battle, taking some of your points, and setting you back into the game. There's new dialogue if you lost to El Niño and La Niño, but it's clear there's no save DT being used, and the game never saved or loaded. The Party Dojo. Not much to say here. You bypass the game over if your defeat is within the dojo. Nothing unusual here. Now, let's finally address the elephant in the room. Chapter 1. Game overs in Chapter 1 function a little differently from any subsequent chapter. You probably encountered this at the very least when fighting Jevil on your first playthrough of the game. But if that was all the way back in the days of the demo program, you may have forgotten exactly what happened, but the behavior is especially interesting given what happens in Chapter 3. It appears you have reached an end. Will you try again? Then the future is in your hands. And to be clear, this game over screen happens regardless of where you die in Chapter 1, even all the way back to the first hazards you encounter, though dying to them is pretty tedious, and subsequent deaths leave you with a simple "will you persist?", a phrase which will come back again in a bit. Declining will lead to the previously shown sequence of the world being lost to darkness, and accepting will reset the player as shown in the other chapters. The typer value in the code for this text is ID 667, one of the 3 typer IDs used in the vessel creation sequence. The others are ID 666 and ID 2, with 666 being used for the initial "Are we connected?" messages, and 2 being used when the process is interrupted. The 667 value is what makes the text render in the glowy, pulsing font, and why it's clear that it's the same voice in both instances, with the IDs 666 and 667 being one piece amongst the massive pile of evidence that the voice is old Dr. Gaster. So, in all likelihood, since it's this voice that we're talking to, and is asking if we wish to return to our save point, it's a fair conclusion to make that Gaster is utilizing save DT to reset the timeline back to our save point. Whether it's his save DT which fills us with power, or whether he's invoking the save DT which fills Kris, or whether it's a function of the device which Gaster controls and connects us to this world, it's clear that Gaster's hands are involved, considering his fingerprints are all over the Chapter 1 save slot menu as well. And much like Flowey did, Gaster's memory persists through these resets, seeing as the message to us changes after the first reset to the simple "will you persist?" The Roaring Night. Such was clear from just the info we had in Chapter 1. But Chapter 3 pours gasoline on the fire and really hammers home Gaster's direct involvement. Chapter 3 sees the return of Typer ID 667. If you have, on any of your 3 save slots, fought the night before, then a special code handling referred to as night mode will trigger, and the vessel creator will offer to reset the fight for you. This includes if you reset your first save file and fight the night again. The vessel creator will modify the point to which you return, hastening your ability to attempt the fight again, and their dialogue will continuously progress and react to the fight, including changing based on whether or not you have the Shadow Mantle equipped or not. Remember when I said we'd come back to whether one user of save DT can cause another's to fail? This is where that becomes relevant. Gaster's control over save DT allows him to reset the timeline to a point in time different from our own save point. He also does it in the same way Omega Flowey does. There's no game over to trigger a resetting of the timeline, since the night doesn't finish us off in the normal progression of time here. He acts as a diegetic way for the soul to attempt an impossible fight in a more convenient way, in a highlighted sequence that far more players will experience than game overing to fights like the Birdley Coaster. Not everyone will see it. It's hidden away for players who naturally would reset to try and see if it's possible, or for players who go out of their way to either find secrets themselves or look them up while doing multiple playthroughs. Meanwhile, those players become less and less likely to game over in the 4 situations where temp saves are created as they become better at the game. Except for 2 places. 2 game overs that I'd wager 99% of completionist players have experienced. 2 places that on repeat playthroughs plenty of people still die to, myself included. Remember when I asked when the last time and the first time you game overed was at the very beginning of the video? I think these 2 spots would top the polls given a wide enough survey of the player base. But before we get to addressing those 2 big elephants in the room, first let's look at some surprise, curveball, diegetic game over changes. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is 2 places which surprised me greatly in the course of game overing everywhere I could. And these are the main reasons I'm happy I went through the whole game again and tested all of these game overs. These 2 places are 2 of the mini-boss fights, Jackenstein and the Sound of Justice. Both of these fights feature a lengthy preamble before them, including a lot of traversing and walking around, and they're both decently threatening fights. If you die during either of them, this blue fire appears, bearing the text, "The blue flame flickers with the vision of a battle unfinished," which allows you to immediately teleport to the beginning of the fight. These are very unique reactions to game overs, but thankfully I believe the text here already provides us with the intended diegetic explanation. These dark sanctuaries are a place where the prophecy reigns, and so the sanctuaries visiting upon us visions of a battle to come, which had already begun, makes just enough sense to me to allow these to be exceptional game overs in the grand scheme of things. A convenient way for Toby to allow the player to skip some tedium while incorporating an element of this particular dark world. It's not save DT, but it is cool. The two elephants. The two game overs, the two specific rooms, the two freak occurrences that spawned this entire video's creation are the fight against John Mantle and the teacups of death. If you've never game overed to either of these places, and you've collected all of the shadow crystals, then I don't believe you. These two locations have special game over handling that, while not as in-depth as night mode, is unique compared to every other game over in the game, and I'd wager have the highest frequency of game overs, other than the fight against the Roaring Knight on the first playthroughs, and probably higher for players on repeat playthroughs. Let's go one at a time and talk about why these game overs are so unique. John Mantle. The fight against John Mantle, ERAM, the Mantle Holder, whatever you want to call them, is unique compared to a normal game over and unique compared to game overs elsewhere in the S-rank boards. Normally if you die to an enemy or obstacle on an S-rank board, the game shuts off and Kris puts the controller down. Then, when you turn the game back on, you reset either the beginning or a checkpoint in the game. But in the Mantle fight, Kris is seen taking real damage from ERAM's attacks, and running out of HP triggers a game over, sort of. The soul bursts as normal, but no game over screen appears. Instead, Kris is just placed back at the temp save that was created at the door of the S-rank room. Kris is free to leave, and restarting the S-rank game will put you back in the digital shelter before the ERAM fight, where the dialogue will be skipped, and one other very key change will be made, but I'll get back to that. The Teacups of Death. The teacup room is weird. When you first arrive, walking inside reveals an empty void, and walking back, you can see the doors closed on Kris. Then you have no choice but to wait for a lengthy period of time while the teacups slowly rise to your level. Then you jump in and very slowly descend to the lower level. If you die on the way up, which admit it you have, everyone has, then you'll respawn at a temp save made before the door shuts behind you. From there you can leave as normal, or you can proceed into the room, but regardless, after only a few short moments the screen will shake and you'll hear a banging sound. That is the sound of the teacups arriving immediately. And this time, when you hop in, the descent is nice and snappy, getting you back to the lower level at a much more reasonable speed. This is the biggest tangible difference in the environment itself after a game over. In my opinion, a larger difference than the flickering flames in Chapter 4. But unlike Chapter 4, there is no diegetic explanation readily apparent. Now, like I said earlier, with the characters skipping their opening dialogues for repeated fights, not every difference on a reset needs to be diegetic. But this difference is a lot more significant seeming to me compared to some skipped lines, and I think the flames in Chapter 4 indicate that Toby would include a diegetic explanation for a large enough change after a reset, and despite there not being an obvious explanation given, I think this room combined with a John Mantle game over establishes a pattern via one thing that both rooms have in common, and that common thread is an association with image_friend. This is why I spent so long examining and going over every game over I could find in Deltarune. I wanted to be sure these two game overs I noticed are truly unique, because these two game overs are also two of the only places where image friend appears. These are also the only two places where friend appears in which it is possible for the player to game over. Image_friend plays specific roles in both game overs, so let's go over those roles. The more solid of the two is friend's role in the Shadow Mantle boss fight. When you game over against ERAM, there is a pity system in place to make the fight easier and easier on subsequent attempts. Each death adds a multiplier to the drop rate of dark candies, referred to as TV dinners and 10 as boards, but in the code as dark candies. And at 7 deaths allows for multiple dark candies to drop within each phase. And these candies specifically drop from defeating friend-shaped enemies in ERAM's ad phases. But until that first death, not a single dark candy will drop from the friends. This is the reason why, even on subsequent playthroughs where the night might feel fairly trivial at this point, the Shadow Mantle fight is particularly hard to first try. That's because to beat ERAM without dying, you have to do so without a single healing item, which in my opinion is significantly harder than beating the night with the aid of the revivements in Shadow Mantle, though that opinion might be skewed by the number of challenge runs I've done for the night fight. Friend is doling out these healing items in the fight after you've already failed, to make the fight more manageable, continuing to help you more the harder you struggle against the unorthodox boss fight. The second friend-related item on the itinerary is his appearance right before the teacups. Friend's sprite appears briefly before disappearing, right where the teacups will appear, but this only happens on the first instance. After you game over and the room is reset, Friend won't appear, and in their place, the teacups will appear much faster. I think here, once again, image_friend is helping you deal with an unorthodox challenge, helping you reattempt it faster by speeding up the teacups both reaching your level and in transporting you back down to the basement faster. But even if you don't fully buy that, Friend is still opting not to appear on subsequent resets. Friend's absence from the room after the temp save is loaded, and Friend's increasingly potent assistance in the fight against EREM as the resets are tallied, to me makes one thing abundantly and incontrovertibly true. Friend is able to retain the memories across a save and load. Just like Gaster and Deltarune, just like Flowey and Undertale. I think there are two potential explanations for this. 1. Friend is in some way a servant or assistant of Gaster, and Gaster is instructing Friend based on his own memory retention to aid Kris in these two challenges. I think this explanation is less likely than the final conclusion I'll present, because Gaster has already demonstrated that he is willing to intervene personally, and would simply do as he did in Chapter 1 and 3 if he wished to aid Kris with the mantle fight and with the teacups. The second explanation is that Image_Friend has the power of saving and loading, of Undertale's determination, and has or had at one point the ability to alter the timelines and manipulate save DT. Friend is a creature of determination, just like Flowey was in Undertale, and can therefore retain the memories when a player saves and loads, or gets a game over. Whether they can still save and load is more dubious. The game over surrounding the mantle fight does behave strangely, and bypassing the normal game over screen would make sense if someone else was resetting the timeline with their own save DT instead of Gaster, who would normally. In Undertale, Frisk's determination overrode Flowey's, but there's nothing to say that that has to hold true in Deltarune. Likewise, if Gaster's ability isn't based on save DT, but on some inherent power of the device he created, then Friend may be the only creature capable of doing so. There's a lot of potential combinations to work with here, but it's clear to me that Friend can retain memories of previous resets, and the only power that we're aware of from Undertale or Deltarune to do so is determination.
And finally, let's listen to all the different ways Toby and his team have hidden the truths of Deltarune within the game's code. How many times has this happened to you? You're watching a Deltarune video or reading a comment on social media, and the author says something along the lines of, in the code there's evidence of X, or the game files prove that Y is true, and you're left with little choice but to just accept these things as true because you're not a coder or a data miner, and even if you have some passing programming knowledge, you wouldn't know where to look to verify what they're saying is true or have the motivation to go through all the effort to disprove it. There are a lot of myths surrounding secrets uncovered by data miners and modders that have spread poorly like a game of telephone, because most of the people who make these claims aren't the ones who've looked into it themselves. My goal in this video is to solidly prove and disprove these myths as needed with direct evidence from the game files in an easy to understand way to help stop the spread of some of the misinformation and hopefully serve as a resource to point to when it's being spread. To that end, if there's anything at all you think I've missed, please leave a comment so I can investigate. There are already a couple of things that I've left out of this video because it was getting way too long, so part 2 will definitely be coming. Huge shoutouts to the Underminers Discord and all the contributors to the Undertale mod tool, without whom this video would be completely impossible. And if you have any interest in data mining or modding GameMaker games, head over there ASAP. Let's jump right into it, starting with the most common example of data mining bait. Unused, the voice in the code. When the survey program was released, it didn't take long before the community started scouring the game's files. The voice in the code is a prominent name now for the speaker of these infamous lines, but in the initial release of the survey program, and still in Chapter 1, you don't actually need to view the game's code to read these lines. They're present in the English language file, lang_en.json, readable in Notepad or similar. This changed in Chapter 2, where the common practice for Deltarune became hard-coding the English language text lines into the code itself, only pulling from an external file when translating the game to Japanese. I won't read them all aloud, they're easy to find online, and I bet a fair few of you practically know them by heart already. Let's dig into the stuff you probably don't know. Coming back to the English language file from the survey program, this brings us to what I believe to be the first misconception, or slightly misleading trait of these lines, and that is the reference to them as unused. If you open that file and search for unused, you'll find lines labeled unused/unused GML 1 through 10_0. This name has meaning in reference to Deltarune's code. Let's look at another file name for example. That is just a bunch of gibberish, written in an easier way to read, that is object Susie bad guy event /step 0 line ID 30. Object is the type, which is usually either object or script, and refers to the next part of the name, which is the name of the either object or script which uses the line of dialogue. Of note, object is equivalent to the all caps device and process, which I'll get into in a future section. After the slash, if the type is an object, the name will include which part of the object's code the line appears in. I'll put when each part of the code is called on screen, pause if you're interested, but it's not super important for this point. If it's a script, then the part after the slash just repeats the first part. Then there's the line number, which when combined with the previous identifier gives a unique line notation that can be referred to elsewhere in the code to retrieve this exact line from the language file. TLDR, the name of the line of dialogue tells us where it's going to be used. Let's go back to our unused line. Unused/unused GML10. So what does this name tell us? Well, it doesn't have an object or a script type, so it's used in neither an object nor a script, but could this still be referring to part of the code? GML global script unused. This is where the dialogue is used, in a function called unused in a file called GML global script unused, which assigns the lines of text to the variables named unused_0 through 9, variables which go, predictably, unused. This is obviously why these lines from the voice and the language files are referred to as unused, because they're labeled as unused about 100 times, and there's no way for them to render as text in the game. But in the strictest sense of the word, they're not really unused. They're deliberately usable by the rest of the code. I could write a mod that calls the unused function, and while nothing would happen in-game, the text would really be loaded into memory, theoretically. It might get optimized out by the compiler or ignored for any other reason, but I would be asking the game to load the text. Calling them unused to me implies that there was some other intended use for these lines, like an interaction that was cut from development or something along those lines, when really these lines are being used for their intended purpose, to convey a message that only players rooting through the files would be able to find. The message the voice is trying to send, yes, but I think there's a clear message from Toby Fox himself, that secrets are being hidden outside of the game, and that there's more to find, so let's find them. Now that I've certainly scared off the majority of the viewers with how densely I'm covering these topics, you might have noticed a pretty big jump in audio quality since my last videos. Hopefully, assuming I haven't royally f***ed up. This video and the last one, the Friends Determination video, took a massive amount of time to research and fact check and double and triple check, and still stuff certainly has slipped through. I do these videos purely as a hobby, and it's a hobby that's put me back in the red after buying a new microphone, if that's any indication of how ad rates are for YouTube videos of my reach. I don't really play the algorithm game. I make these videos because they're a fun hobby and I don't mind investing my own cash into a hobby I enjoy. So I'm immensely grateful that these videos so far have had such a response that they can help feed into themselves and improve the overall experience for y'all. To that end, I'd really like to be able to continue justifying spending all the extra time and effort these sort of deep nitty-gritty videos take. I want to make these videos better, and whether that means non-free editing software, taking editing courses, or enlisting some help so that it's not just me working on this stuff, it takes money that I'll probably pay anyways. But if you feel like helping out, and really truly only if you really want to and can afford to, I've started a Patreon and I've turned on YouTube memberships. I don't plan on locking any content behind it or doing any early member releases or anything like that. I already share little progress updates on videos and what I'm working on in the Discords, and I won't stop doing that. So it's really just if you like the stuff I make and want to see me make more, better stuff, then it's there to support me and see those updates in a less ephemeral place than in a Discord server. Otherwise, I'm incredibly grateful to anyone who just watches these videos that I make, so let's get back to the fun code stuff. The Toriel variable. Jumping ahead to Chapter 3. If you already know what a variable is, you can skip ahead 20 seconds, but a super quick programming 101 is that a variable is a named container for some value, and you can put some data into a variable like a number or a string of characters, give it a name, and then ask for that data back later using the name you decided on. Then you can do whatever you want with that data, like perform a math operation or make comparisons with other data by referring to it by your chosen name. Importantly, it's programming best practice to use variables whose names make it clear to someone who's reading the code what the data contained within it is. For example, here's the base list of variables which every enemy on one of the S-rank boards has. Speed, move direction, max HP, whether or not it's currently aggressive. Sometimes, a variable's name can be ambiguous though. MoveCon, for instance, would be hard to discern its purpose without looking through the code, where you can work out that it's a rolling counter that keeps track of which part of the enemy's movement pattern the enemy currently is in. MoveCon's variable name is ambiguous due to the complexity of its purpose. Quick tangent that maybe no one other than me would find interesting. I was curious about why MoveCon was the variable name chosen. I already know from looking through the code that con is the frequently used name for this sort of variable which iterates upwards as the game moves objects through states. But con didn't seem short for anything sensible to me, with the closest that came to mind being condition. Well, it turns out if you go digging through the Undertale code, some of the very earliest examples of this sort of state-changing programming pattern that Toby used is in the earliest dialogue sequences in the Ruins. These sequences, where normally a con variable would be used, instead uses a variable conversation. So presumably what happened is that Toby quickly started shortening conversation to con and the even shorter CN, and then when similar patterns cropped up later in Undertale that weren't necessarily conversation-based, like picking out music in Maps to Blue's house, he kept using con as a variable name to keep the purpose clear for himself, even if what it stands for no longer really made sense. So this variable is technically named move conversation, but it really is just a naming holdover from some of the very earliest things that Toby Fox programmed for Undertale. Sorry, that was me in real time writing that into the script as I worked out the answer to that mystery. Why else would a variable be ambiguous other than the purpose being difficult to fully explain in a reasonable length name? Well, sometimes it's just bad practice. Let's play a game. What is this variable for? If your guess was, it's how the Balthazard randomly distributes the damage of its incense cloud attack, then you're right. Any other answer is wrong, sorry. I call this bad practice, but in reality, especially for variables that are only used in one specific spot like this, it's incredibly common to name them something generic that doesn't give much away. What's less common but still prevalent is variables that are ambiguous because they're a joke or pop culture reference. For example, the "you're a boss" variable, which is used during the saving process, which records whether you've defeated the super bosses of any given chapter to your save file. So what does it mean when a variable is none of these? When a variable's name doesn't tell us what it does, yet it clearly is not a placeholder like X or foobar, when it's not making a joke and yet its function couldn't be more clear. And what if that function is to basically do nothing? Or at least do nothing in a way that could have been done in a much simpler way than including lines of code that equate to a useless machine that turns itself off at the flip of a switch. It means that there's some other intent behind the variable and the code it's a part of. We already know from the message left by the unused dialogue that Toby Fox has left us secrets to find by digging through the game's files. And this unassuming variable named Toriel is my personal favorite. There are a lot of moving parts to this one, so let's take it one step at a time. In the third S-rank board, there are a series of individual rooms with monsters inside that seem to represent different hometowners. You can draw parallels to some character relationships in Undertale, while others see ties to the hometown Deltaruner's layout according to the popular roots theory from Gold Pro. One room in particular is a bit more uncanny. When you walk into this room, across an unpassable abyss is a pitch-black monster sprite, in the shape identical to those that are most closely analogous to Asgore and Toriel. This monster directly mirrors every move that you make as Mini Kris. Attempting to attack across the chasm reveals the monster to be invincible, and the only way to defeat it is to maneuver the monster onto a switch on their side of the chasm as Kris stands on the switch of their own. The chasm disappears, and from then on, Kris remains stationary, and you control the monster itself until it comes within a certain distance of Kris, at which point Kris strikes the monster with no input from the player, who then regains control of Kris. So where does this variable called Toriel come into play? Well, let's observe what happens when I remove one single line from the logic which handles the spawning of enemies on the S-rank board. The black sprite is now in the shape of a deer, complete with animations and left-right facing logic. This requires no additions to the code, just the removal of one line set in the Toriel variable to true, but one other thing has changed as a result. Now, it is possible to strike the deer with Kris's sword, and you can see if I freeze frame it that the sprite flashing is the hurt sprite from its normal monster sprite. So what exactly is going on here? Let's take a look. If you remember the base list of variables which every enemy has, which I showed earlier, monsters on the S-rank boards also have a list of variables that are specific to each one of them. Like here in the lizard enemy's create script, it sets its HP to 2, its speed to 5, and a whole bunch of other stuff related to its specific logic. So which one of these create scripts initializes the monster that mirrors our movement? It's this one, OBJ board enemy black deer create 0. And here is where we see the origin of the Toriel variable. We can see the natural state of the Toriel variable is false. So that one line we removed, which was called every time one of these monsters was created, set the Toriel variable to be true. Now we know what created the Toriel variable and where it was turned on. What exactly does that change? Well, there are two places in the code which check to see whether Toriel is true or false. The first is in the Black Deer Step 2 script. Once all of the movement logic is done, at the very bottom of the file, the script looks at which way Kris is facing. Then it picks the black deer sprite which matches the opposite facing, creating the mirrored sprite flipping. Then the code tries to pick the hurt sprite accordingly and assigns a brighter deer sprite to create a matching animation for being hit, but I believe there was a mistake on the programmer's part here. It's supposed to check for sprite board, deer, R, and L black, but instead, it looks for sprites without the underscore black at the end. Adding underscore black to the end of each of these checks results in the hurt sprite animation playing properly, otherwise there is no situation where these hurt sprites would be properly assigned, so I'm fairly confident that this is a bug that understandably never got caught, because it can only occur after we've already removed a line of code, remember. And then, we reach the end of the script. After doing all of that work determining which way Kris faces and loading the correct sprite, the game asks the Toriel variable whether it is true or false. If Toriel is true, which in the normal course of gameplay it always is, it reassigns the sprite to the sprite board monster black and the hurt sprite to the corresponding hurt sprite. If it's false, the sprites are left as is. Side note, in our little mod of the game, Toriel is set to false, so the hurt sprite should never have had a chance to be assigned to the original unfixed version, right? So why are we seeing the base monster hurt sprite flashing in the first version? Remember the base list of variables again? One of the default values is the hurt sprite, and the default is again the sprite board monster hurt sprite. So despite it never being manually assigned, with nothing else to fall back on, it happens to still result in the same sprite as the base games, despite it technically originating from a different place now. Getting back on track, this bit of code is what I was referring to when I brought up the useless machines. The code at the bottom of this file serves worse than no purpose. Every frame, the game goes through this process of picking a sprite that will never be seen, only to immediately shut the box on itself and revert to the goat monster sprite. This is worse than useless from a purely functional perspective. In-game, it would be completely functionally equivalent if the deer's create script just assigned sprite board monster black and sprite board monster hurt, and you would be saving programming cycles by skipping logic checks, memory by not loading in an extra handful of sprites, and human lifespan by not having someone write code that's extraneous and purposeless. So logically, the only reason for this code to exist is if someone wanted us to find it, to see that this enemy could instead be seen as a black deer, and it being so useless from a programming perspective is what makes it clear that it doesn't fall under the umbrella of cut or unused content. Because if it was, it'd have just been deleted in the first place. It's a hint to give us confidence that this is an intentional secret to be found that has meaning to be interpreted. Where else is this Toriel variable checked? It's checked at the top of the Black Deer's Step 0 script. There is a check at the very beginning of the script which determines whether Kris's sword should be able to make contact with and damage the Black Deer monster. This check is looking at two variables at once, the nebulous Toriel variable and the controlled variable, which is set to true when the player takes control of the Black Deer monster. The check reads like this: if we aren't in control of the Black Deer, Kris's attack should only work if Toriel is set to false. So that line that we deleted earlier, which sets Toriel to true and changes the sprite to the goat monster, is what protects that monster and prevents Kris from attacking it, until we are no longer in control of Kris. Again, this code would be much simpler if the Toriel variable was simply removed, and there would be no observable difference in game. Just check if control is true, and if so, allow the collision detection. That, my friends, is the extent of what the Toriel variable does. Now, some of the misinformation I've seen spread is any relation to the other semi-deer related board enemy, the White Hood. The Toriel variable has absolutely nothing to do with this monster, and in fact, the non-black deer sprite is much closer, in my opinion, to actually unused content. There is no code that references this sprite. Turning Toriel true or false does not reveal a deer underneath. This sprite is connected to the White Hood, but its connections are looser than the black deer connection. For one, the white-hooded character's name in the code is obj board enemy deer, which is mirrored by the sprite's name, sprite board deer L and R. However, unlike the black deer, which in the object's definition uses the black deer sprite, the white hood's default sprite is still the familiar white hood sprite. There is a place where sprite board deer R is used, but it's only viewable in the Undertale mod tool, and it's here, in the object definition of the enemy spawner. You can see it has sprites for all of the monsters listed, and while the sprite isn't used in-game, each instance of an enemy spawner, when viewed in the room viewer, displays a sprite corresponding to which monster is spawned, and the White Hood spawner is this basic deer sprite. Onto some speculation time. What does it all mean? I've given a more significant breakdown of what I think in terms of theorizing in the second Soul Possession video, but in summary, I think these are the important points that these bits of code are pointing at. The black deer represents Des, and the normal deer represents Noelle. The White Hood has ice magic, wears a white hood, freezes a bird, and follows Kris, all traits that Noelle shares. That and the deer thing. Des makes the most sense as the counterpart, since she's got the dark, edgy goth vibe based on her room, and her whereabouts are shrouded in darkness. It could be another holiday, but I'd expect a Carol deer to be blue or white in color, and a Rudy deer to have some indication of his illness. Toriel both is hiding something related to Des, and is protecting or has protected Des in the past. The variable bearing her name is what obscures the true form of the black deer, and it stops Kris from hurting it. What and why that could be is a total mystery. There is some soul fuckery going on with Des. The black deer is the only thing we directly control outside of the board mini version of Kris, and we're explicitly shown the soul as being the method through which mini Kris is controlled. Likewise, the soul then controls the black deer, and given the opportunity, prioritizes controlling Des over controlling Kris. Is that representing some past event where Des was possessed by a soul? I think so, but that's well into the realm of speculation, and I'd be retreading the second soul possession video ground. Kris, at some point, tried to harm Des, and perhaps succeeded, or sees himself harming Des in the future and acts on their current opportunity. Completely separated from our control, mini Kris strikes down Des at the first opportunity. Is this a manifestation of Kris's potentially violent tendencies? Or Kris in the present trying to keep us from learning something about the black deer monster, just like they tried to keep us out of the shelter? Questions. But that's finally all for the Toriel variable. Let's look at something else Kris violence related. Kris's damage. Kris's damage is commonly known to fluctuate in two situations, versus Tenna and versus the Roaring Knight. How exactly does this work? Against Tenna, Kris deals massively increased damage if they've completed the sword route. That's a well-known piece of trivia, but did you know that Kris actually deals substantially less damage to Tenna if the sword route hasn't been completed, even compared to normal enemies? Check out the code here. In a normal save file, Kris will deal 50% of their normal damage to Tenna if the sword route hasn't been completed, versus 300% damage if it has. That's based on this Did Kris Do Sword Route variable, which is set to the value of this global flag 1050. The global flags are a long list of variables that constitute all of the events, states, etc. that would be saved to your save file, and can be referred to at any later time. You can find lists online and in the Underminers Discord of all the different flags, but I found the most effective way to understand what these individual flags do is to examine the code itself. So let's do that for 1050. As you can see here, Flag 1050 is set right at the beginning of the outro cutscene that plays after beating the Shadow Mantle fight. The exact timing of this is important because many of the people will attribute Kris's damage bonus to Kris being angry with Tenna, following Tenna revealing that he had conspired with Kris prior to the Shadow Mantle fight. But as is evident by when the flag is set, it's possible for that conversation to play, Kris fight and lose the fight against the Shadow Mantle, then give up and move on to the end of the chapter and fight Tenna. If you were to do so, Kris is still hesitating to attack Tenna and deals the reduced 50% damage output, even though the player would have witnessed Tenna spilling all their secrets. So, assuming the timing of the flag being switched isn't a development oversight, which it very well could be, instead we'd have to assume that there's something to this conversation which spurs Kris on to fight. The Shadow Mantle holder is clearly inciting Kris's violent tendencies before and after the fight, so it could be a manifestation of that, or it could be the result of coming to own the Shadow Mantle itself for some reason, as acquiring the Shadow Mantle is a required part of the rest of the sequence. There's no way to dodge picking up the Shadow Mantle after that flag is set to true. But if it were due to the Shadow Mantle, I think it would be more likely for the developers to make use of the script armor check inventory function, which is used by the hidden Tenna Spamton cutscene to determine if the player has either of the Spamton boss items and choose which cutscene to play based on whether they have either or not. In short, assuming there aren't any mistakes in the code, which is a fairly large assumption, seeing as I've pointed out some code that I believe is already a mistake once in this video, it's likely that it's Kris's conversation with the Shadow Mantle holder, which results in Kris dealing 6 times as much damage as a non-sword route run. Let's move on to the Knight. First off, the Roaring Knight has a base amount of damage resistance that applies to all of the Fun Gang's attacks, which is separate from the Knight's defense. At the beginning of the fight, every character's damage output is reduced to 20% of their normal value. Then with each turn that passes, they regain a flat 1% of their damage, up to a maximum of 35% at 15 turns. After that damage reduction is applied, it moves onto the Kris step. First off, just like against Tenna, with no other factors, Kris is dealing 50% of their normal damage output. Already that implies the Knight and Tenna are on the same level of Kris's hesitancy to harm, as without any other influence, Kris is pretty heavily pulling their punches against both of them and by the exact same amount. Most of the time I see Kris's damage increase against the knight mentioned, it's only mentioned that their damage is high when both Susie and Rousey are down. But in fact, if either Rousey or Susie are reduced to below 0 HP, Kris will return to their normal damage output, losing that 50% multiplier, effectively doubling the damage they're dealing to the knight. If the second party member goes down, that doubles again, resulting in a 200% total damage output from Kris before the knight's innate scaling damage reduction is applied. It's still lower than the 300% damage Kris deals to Tenna post sword route, but it's still a lot of damage for their regular attacks. You might be surprised to know that these aren't the first times Kris has pulled their punches in a fight. All the way back in Chapter 1, very similar looking code is used to reduce Kris and Rousey's damage output to 30% when targeting Susie in the versus Susie and Lancer fight. Could that be Kris and Rousey's reluctance to harm Susie for real? Or maybe, like the Knight's innate damage resistance, it represents the hardiness of Lightners and their resilience against attacks in the Dark Worlds? It's probably not the latter, since Burly takes full damage from the gang's attacks, and if it is the former, then damn, they must really hate Burly after all. The only damage reduction going on in Chapter 2 is when Spamton Neo's defense increases at the end of the Weird Route solo fight. Chapter 4 features a little bit of damage multiplier fuckery as well, but it's mostly against the Titan and the Titan spawn. The Titan obviously goes through phases of natural damage reduction based on whether you've exposed its weak point, but when the Black Shard is equipped, Kris always gets a massive damage multiplier regardless, making attacking the Titan even with its shields up quite effective. But look at that, there's a curious check right here, indicating that another piece of equipment would grant the same damage increase. I wonder what that could be. It's the Twisted Sword, bringing another code-based urban legend somewhat full circle, a legend that I'll probably have to get to in Part 2. The Device Naming Scheme. In Deltarune's codebase, there are two distinct ways files are named. The vast majority of assets and resources use an all, or mostly all, lowercase naming scheme, with a prefix that determines what type of resource it is. The important ones are OBJ for game objects, room for rooms, SPR for sprites, and SND for sounds. Files with this naming scheme encapsulate the entirety of everything that appears in the light and dark worlds, with seldom few exceptions. Even all of the objects on Tenna's game board follow this format, just with board included as part of the prefix, such as OBJ board bridge. Where it gets interesting is with resources that aren't associated with the light world or dark world. These are the assets associated with the Goner Maker sequence, save file menus, title screens, game overs, and the dog check, which is the screen which appears when trying to access inaccessible rooms. With these resources, the normal prefixes are replaced in the following ways. OBJ becomes device or process, room becomes place, SPR becomes image, and SND becomes audio, with all of the new names being in all caps. So for instance, the room which contains the game over screen is called place failure, and the handler for the vessel creation sequence is device Goner Maker. Generally, any of the resources associated with the aforementioned categories follow this all caps naming scheme with the alternate prefixes. It's not 100% consistent. For example, most of the resources associated with the chapter select follow the lowercase naming of the light world and dark world assets, but generally this pattern is followed pretty strongly. There is an exception, and that is friend. In Chapter 2, friend has two associated resources, image friend, which is handled by device friend, referring to a sprite and a game object respectively. In Chapter 4, we get Image Friend and Image Friend W, which appear in the Church Dark World and in the Batat minigame, respectively. In Chapter 3, however, Friend's appearance does not follow this trend, and instead refers to Friend ambiguously, and in the lowercase naming scheme. During Rousey's Dark World Objects lecture, we glimpse Sprite Nondescript Room _ face, and Sprite Nondescript Room _ laugh. On the first S-rank board, OBJ board Sword Shadow T's teeth, and OBJ board sword Shadow T's face can be found, and these game objects utilize the sprites SPR _ laugh and SPR _ eyes, and in the fight against the mantle holder, the little friend spawns are simply OBJ _ with sprite SPR _. It's curious that in this specific chapter, friends' resources follow a different naming scheme. The formatting of these names compared to others would imply that the object's name is just underscore or underscore or blank, but more likely is that it's some form of censoring of the name. If the all uppercase friend is similar to the uppercase place and device prefixes, it could be that friend is a device layer replacement for friend's real name, which has been censored for in-game or out-of-game reasons. There's a lot to dig into with these file names and all the implications, so I will once again point you to Molly Stars' device theory videos for the de facto breakdown. They're really good. really, really good. The Shadow Mantle holder's name. This is a common topic that people will often bring up the code nebulously as evidence of the S-Rank board's boss being named Nightmare or ERAM without any real further elaboration. In fact, it's happened in my own YouTube comments, so let's go over how exactly Deltarune's code refers to the Shadow Mantle holder. The most common reference to the mantle holder is simply as Shadow Mantle. Every one of its game objects and sprites uses this formatting for its name, such as OBJ Shadow Mantle Enemy and SPR Shadow Mantle Laugh. The code does not refer to the boss in any other specific way. Even variables in the code use this name, like Shadow Mantle Move. The name Nightmare comes from the raw audio file names for two OST tracks related to the Shadow Mantle boss fight, Nightmare Boss Heavy.ogg and Nightmare NES.ogg. The official names for these tracks on the OST are Burning Eyes and the source of the other most popular fan name for the boss, ERAM. Neither of these names are used in the codebase to refer to the boss. The name ERAM never appears in the code files, and Nightmare only appears as part of the calls to begin those two specific music tracks. In short, the code only ever refers to the boss as Shadow Mantle or Shadow Mantle Enemy. So if that's the primary source you want to use, then that is the boss's name. It's by far the most frequent reference to the boss, but doing so might conflict with the boss stating that it's holding the Shadow Mantle, depending on how you want to read that statement. So if you want to go by the sound files names, then it simply depends on whether you feel the two unofficial track names outweigh the one official track name, being Nightmare and ERAM respectively. Either, I think, are equally valid. I personally lead towards ERAM, but that's just to distinguish between it and the Legend of Zelda boss that the mantle holder is a reference to. Kris Preservation Society. This little Easter egg is up there in terms of how promising it sounds. A hidden variable with a name like Kris Preservation Society? That must be important, right? Well, this is one reason why I spent so long in the Toriel variable section talking about naming variables and the significance behind why you would name certain variables certain ways. Kris Preservation Society is a very important sounding name. It's ominous and shadowy. It's hard not to think that there's some deeper meaning behind it. Unfortunately, the KPS variable really doesn't have a lot going for it other than the name. Unlike the Toriel variable, which is used in multiple places, obscures specific information, has additional assets tied to it, and has a non-negligible amount of code specifically tied to it, the KPS variable just doesn't. Do you remember that example I gave, the random variable A, which does some random little thing? That's the level of programmatic importance that the KPS variable is given. Variable A and variable Kris Preservation Society are both examples of local variables. Without getting too lost in the weeds, we can also call these temporary variables. These are variables which are created within the context of a small chunk of code and then discarded as soon as the task is done. This is in contrast to the Toriel variable, which is perpetually tied to the Black Deer as an instance variable. From a usability standpoint, that just means that the Toriel variable can be referred to and checked for as long as the Black Deer monster exists. But the KPS variable only exists for the brief moment that it's used, and the task that it's used for is substantially less impactful than even the Toriel variable's marginal impact on the game. What is its actual use then? The Kris Preservation Society variable is a temporary variable that is assigned the string since chapter X, where X is the chapter where your current save file was created. That variable is then handed off to the drawText function, which adds that text to the screen over the stats menu in the light world. This is an area where even the Deltarune wiki is slightly inaccurate. It reads, a file is continued from chapter 1 into chapter 2 displays since chapter 1 in the top right part of the menu. The variable internally used to track this is referenced as Kris Preservation Society. But the variable which tracks the chapter a file was created in is the global flag number 914. Kris Preservation Society is just a temporary variable that holds the full string after flag 914 gets read. It's then immediately discarded and never used again. When the menu is reopened later, flag 914 is read again, and a new Kris Preservation Society temporary variable is created. That's not at all intended to be a knock on the wiki. This is how I've seen pretty much everyone refer to the KPS variable, and I think the distinction is important. I'll once again bring up the example of variable A and also the Euroboss variable. These are both local, temporary variables which are used for a very specific short-term task and then discarded. These are the types of variables which are most commonly given names which don't well describe their usage because they're not used elsewhere. It isn't important for someone working on the code to know at a glance what the YourBoss variable does, because it's only used within the context of its specific little chunk of code, and if you're already looking there, then you can just look at the code to understand what it's doing. These are the variables which can be jokey and unserious because even though it'd technically be better code practice to give them proper names that describe their purpose, giving them one-off temporary sounding names can properly communicate to someone else, or to yourself in the future, working on the code that this variable isn't all that important. It's not meant to be used elsewhere, it's not a permanent data structure that you can call elsewhere, it's just a random math variable A that's used in this chunk of code and nowhere else. That is the same vibe I get from the Kris Preservation Society. If it weren't for its name, this would just be another random temp variable X in the code, with the same level of ephemerality as any other, and it does kind of read like a joke. The Kris Preservation Society, which tells the player how long this Kris save file has been preserved. It feels like, to me, if there were an intended deeper meaning, it'd be more likely that it would have been added to the global variables, like how you can see in the same script as the KPS variable Kris's XP, gold, and stats are. A global.Kris Preservation Society instead of a random flag number. That's not to say that there's no significance. It is the only one of these lines in the stats screen which is first assigned to a local variable and then drawn to the screen, which does make it look a bit more intentionally placed by having it stand out amongst the others, but I do think that compared to the Toriel variable, KPS is substantially less significant and gives us a lot less to go on. Kris and Ralsei aren't safe. For this one, I'm entering full debunk mode. Unlike Kris Preservation Society, which at least has a little bit of mystery attached, the Kris and Ralsei aren't safe variables are completely and totally nothing, along with the actual variable, not all characters are safe. I'm not sure how prevalent these are anymore, since, like I said, there's a completely mundane explanation for these, but I've seen them brought up occasionally, and the Reddit thread referring to them is still the first result, for me at least, when searching up info about the Kris Preservation Society. To start with, Kris isn't safe and Ralsei isn't safe are not and were not ever variables, and in the current version of the game, these lines do not exist at all. In version 1.00 of Chapter 2, two debug messages were present that stated Kris isn't safe and Ralsei isn't safe. These sorts of messages are used by developers to verify that certain code is being called and ensuring that the game is working as expected. In some version after 1.00, these messages were removed, presumably either due to these misconceptions from the community or simply to clean up the number of debug messages that weren't needed. So when did they appear? In this little block of code here, you can see their relationship to this variable, not all characters are safe, which still exists in today's current version of Chapter 2. But that's still a pretty ominous sounding name too, right? There's gotta be something significant here, right? No. In this case, this is a variable that's deceptively ominous, but is actually describing something very, very mundane. In Chapter 2, during the Acid Tunnel of Love sequence, you have this bridge swapping portion, and what happens when one of the characters is standing on a bridge that can be swapped on or off? Then the variable ticks above 0, marking that one or more of the characters isn't safe and is on one of the bridges. Why does that need to be checked? Because if either of the characters isn't safe, the game needs to play this little cutscene which recenters Kris and Ralsei together in the same place, back on solid ground, so that this doesn't happen. And that is all for part 1. If you can think of any other code-related rumors, leave them in the comments or mention them in the Discord.
Thanks for listening, if you're not already asleep, to this extra silly April Fool's thing. Originally I thought about re-recording all of the video's audio with the new microphone and the softer delivery, but the amount of time just redoing the first video took meant that wouldn't have been feasible with how soon April 1st is coming up. But I'm very glad this gave me an excuse to do a version of the second Soul Possession video that's actually watchable. A lot's changed in 6 months. Let's see what the next 6 has in store.